Amid the burning oil wells of Kuwait, two armies faced each other on the edge of battle. At stake, the oil fields of the Middle East. It was a war whose weaponry would give a glimpse of how men will fight in the 21st century. A war which would allow America to banish the ghosts of Vietnam and rediscover confidence in its military might. A war which would curb an aggressive dictator with nuclear ambitions. And a war which would do much to shape the world we live in. This is its story. Eight weeks before plunging the Middle East into war, Saddam Hussein welcomed his neighbor, the Emir of Kuwait. The Emir ruled one of the richest countries on earth. Kuwait had less than 1 million citizens, but 1/10 of the world's oil. Saddam was a dictator with ambitions. For 8 years, he fought Iran. Now, 2 years on, he was using Iraq's huge oil revenues to develop nuclear weapons and equip a 1 million-strong army. He wanted to challenge Israel and dominate the Middle East. But the British and American governments thought he was a dictator they could do business with.
We had thought this man has fought a war against Iran for 8 years. During those 8 years, something like 500,000 young people have been killed. 500,000 on both sides. Surely after that, he can't go and have another military operation.
The idea that on a Sunday afternoon or something, I was going to stroll into the Oval and go, oh, by the way, Mr. President, Saddam Hussein is going to mass 100,000 plus forces and is going to walk into Kuwait and is going to make this the 19th province of Iraq. And this is going to be the major test of the post-Cold War world. That was too big. It was too dramatic.
But that day in May 1990, Saddam was fighting to survive. His military ambitions meant Iraq was living beyond its means. The price of oil was plummeting. The country would be bankrupt in 3 months. Saddam blamed the Emir. The Emir was flooding the market with cheap oil. Cheap oil meant bigger profits for the thousands of companies Kuwait owned in the West. Later, when the day's business was over, Saddam summoned the Arab leaders to a private meeting. When the cameras left, he warned the Emir to stop pushing down the price of oil.
He said each dollar less in price means to us 1 billion in revenues for a year. If you do not mean waging a war against Iraq, please stop it.
As economic collapse approached, Saddam used vast rallies to whip up opinion against Kuwait. But the Emir took a tough stand. Saddam and his inner circle scented a conspiracy to crush their regime before they could challenge Israel.
By the end of June, we started to realize that there is a conspiracy against Iraq, a deliberate conspiracy against Iraq by Kuwait, organized, devised by the United States.
Saddam summoned the key men in his regime. They decided unless Kuwait handed over $10 billion immediately, Iraq would invade. Saddam ordered the Republican Guard to move south towards Iraq's border with Kuwait. These were the Iraqi army's elite divisions. Equipped with modern Soviet tanks, no other Middle Eastern country except Israel had forces to rival them. Soon, on the border between Iraq and Kuwait, 30,000 Iraqi troops had massed. A traveling British diplomat saw them and told American military intelligence.
Our first indication came from a human intelligence source, a very reliable one, who identified 3 Republican Guard divisions moving south toward Kuwait.
In Washington, America's most senior soldier was soon inspecting pictures from a spy satellite and trying to piece together the Iraqi plan.
Over the next few days, over a relatively short period of time, more and more information came forward that started to put these pieces in place. Artillery was coming forward. Logistics units were being seen. Signals networks were coming up, to the point that finally it could not be ignored, and I called General Schwarzkopf and said, "Norm, are you looking at what I'm looking at?" And he says, "Yes."
It was only when we started to see this pattern of the type of forces that you would need to conduct an operation being grouped together geographically on the ground that it became very apparent that what you were seeing emerging was a military plan.
The news was passed to George Bush, then in his second year as president. Satellite pictures couldn't tell him what Saddam intended, but the president and his national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, knew vital interests were at stake.
The notion of Iraq, which was an oil powerhouse in itself, acquiring the Kuwaiti resources and thus perhaps being able to dominate OPEC was a tremendous danger.
Help was at hand. With the crisis building, one of America's closest allies in the Middle East had rushed to Baghdad. Once again, the band played and the red carpet was rolled out. The president of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, had been sent by the Arab world to discover Saddam's plans. It was an encounter that would have far-reaching consequences.
I met with Saddam Hussein. He met me in the airport. Then he took me in the car. He was driving, beside him, nobody with us, until we went to one of the palaces near the lake there. And we went upstairs to the first floor, tete-a-tete, in a big room, and we were both alone, nobody with us. I asked him about what's the problem, what's happening. I told him, do you have any intention to attack them, invade them? He told me, no, but don't tell the Kuwaitis about that. It was a very clear answer.
As soon as he left Iraq, the Egyptian president telephoned the White House with the news that Saddam was bluffing. Mubarak told George Bush that the Iraqi leader was desperate for money, but the Arabs could sort things out. President Mubarak flew on to Kuwait. The emir was desperate for news. As soon as the two leaders were alone, the emir began to describe the pressure he was under.
He told me that Saddam Hussein asked me to give him $10 billion cash. He told me I cannot bring 10 billion cash now. Anyway, I told him what happened between me and Saddam. In the evening, I told him there is no intention to attack Kuwait, as Saddam said. But he told me, don't tell him. But I told him because they were terrified.
When we made general offers to the Kuwaitis of military support, their response was, stay away from us. We can handle this. We can handle this together with our Arab brothers. The most we'll have to deal with is problems at the Arab League. We'll negotiate this. Don't take actions that will provoke the Iraqis to do what we fear they might do.
The 30,000 troops on Kuwait's border became 100,000, but nothing was done. For 7 days, Arab leaders insisted this was bluff. In London and Washington, politicians used to doing business with Saddam gave him the benefit of the doubt. In Saudi Arabia, on August the 1st, the Iraqis walked out of talks. Saddam issued his orders.
من جمعونا بالليلة نفسها بالليل نريد نتحرك بين الكويت جمعونا الساعة 4 العصر.
We gathered at 4 o'clock on the afternoon before the invasion.
أسماء مناطق الكويت على المنضدة. وبعدين هم كانوا.
On a map table, we were shown our objectives in Kuwait.
أمر فوجنا. بعدين من.
Our captain explained the Kuwaiti government was about to change. We've been asked to help set up the new government.
الحكومة الكويتية راح تتغير وطالبين نعاون الحكومة الكويتية لترتيب الحكومة الجديدة.
Now in exile, at that time General Wafiq al-Samurai met Saddam almost daily. He remembers Saddam double-checking his calculations.
Saddam thought any reprisals would be limited and would tail off with time. He believed that America's involvement in Vietnam had destroyed its willingness to use military power. Vietnam had been an outright defeat.
As they spoke, a satellite took this photograph. American intelligence analysts searched for the bases which had been crammed with hundreds of Iraqi tanks. But when they found them, the bases were empty. Tank tracks led towards Kuwait. The Pentagon went to its highest alert level.
We issued WatchCon 1. It was the first time the DIA, since the system was established, had gone to WatchCon 1 because we wanted to make it very clear that this was a different condition. The buildup was complete. We would receive no more warning, but the invasion was imminent.
I was essentially deputized to go back to the White House to meet with Scowcroft and the president and to convince them to take one last shot at trying to influence Saddam. And just as we were talking about what exactly he would say to Saddam in this last effort to get him to think twice before doing anything, that's when the phone rang saying, "We just heard from our people in Kuwait, shooting has started, this war, whatever it is, has begun."
Republican Guard tanks started to seal off the city. Special forces were landed by helicopter on the beaches. They advanced to seize key government buildings. The emir had stood down his army to avoid provoking Saddam. Many Kuwaiti officers were abroad on their summer holidays.
I received a call from a friend in the foreign ministry, and he told me that the foreign minister said that now, and stressed now, is the time for the U.S. to act. And I said to him, there may have been a time to act yesterday, there may be a time to act in the future, but I don't know what we can do right now.
A few Kuwaiti units mounted a hasty defense of the emir and his palace, but Iraqi tanks soon overwhelmed them. The emir was driven away with minutes to spare. The emir and his bodyguard made for Saudi Arabia, mingling with confused rush hour traffic. Iraqi intelligence had expected the emir's capture and already anticipated how he would be dealt with.
القسم الآخر من السموم هو الثاليوم.
Thallium is a poison that has a very strong impact on the nervous system. It leads to death within 1 month of administration. It's what has happened many times to opposition figures.
وحصلت هكذا حالات كثيرة تجاه المعارضة.
By noon, Saddam Hussein controlled 1/5 of the world's oil.
For us it was shocking, shocking. I couldn't believe that this could happen in the Arab world. Saddam Hussein, we were very in good terms and he was a friend, we know each other very well, but didn't expect him to do that.
Saddam probably figured the Arab world and the world at large would bitch and moan for a couple of days, and then people would get used to it. And the world would essentially learn to live with it. And the United States, which had left Lebanon a decade before and so forth, was not going to do anything, and even if the United States wanted to do something, the local Arabs would never do anything. They would never work with the United States and stand up to Saddam. So I think Saddam took the pretty intelligent decision that he could probably get away with it.
But we really needed some time to come to grips with this basic fundamental question of our strategic assessment of what this meant. Did it matter that he'd taken Kuwait?
To put it bluntly, what we ultimately did, sending 500,000 people around the world and all that entailed, that was too big of a thought for people at that first meeting even to think about. So instead, you had people talking all over the place, many of whom were talking about how we could live with this.
The president left to give a speech in Aspen, Colorado. Brent Scowcroft traveled with him.
The president was way out in front of most of his advisors. He felt the same way I did about it, about the sort of resigned tone of the meeting, and that there was no sense of outrage or no sense of imperative.
But now Saddam Hussein had his first stroke of bad luck. Another leader was also in Aspen.
George Bush just said to me, Margaret, what is your view? And so indeed I told him that aggressors must be stopped. Not only stopped, but they must be thrown out. An aggressor cannot gain from his aggression. He must be thrown out, and really, by that time in my mind, I thought we ought to throw him out so decisively that he could never think of doing it again.
The president said little to the press, but he was already inclining towards action. Margaret Thatcher remembers telling him Saddam Hussein was a potential Hitler who had to be stopped. It was talk that steeled the president's determination. The president returned to Washington. He led a country for whom the last war was not the war with Hitler, but the quagmire of Vietnam. Nevertheless, at the White House and later at Camp David, the president and his advisors now met to take the first steps towards war. The CIA director began with an electrifying warning.
Over 100,000 Iraqi troops had found their way south of Kuwait City, indicating yet another intention beyond the invasion of Kuwait, either to terrorize Saudi Arabia or to actually invade it.
Well, one of the first questions was, is he going to stop at the borders of Kuwait? Saddam, is he going to stop there? Or is he likely to go on into Saudi Arabia and move down to the oil fields?
We had no idea what he was going to do. Everybody'd been dead wrong with respect to the question of whether or not he was going to invade Kuwait, and he'd invaded Kuwait, and he had 140,000 Iraqi troops on the Saudi border. The key decision that came out of that meeting is, we will defend Saudi Arabia. There was no debate about that. The question I then posed is, then what? Are we prepared, should we be prepared to go forward and fight for Kuwait?
The president made no response. Vietnam had shaped Colin Powell. Powell feared the military was again in danger of being trapped in an unpopular war in a faraway place.
For those of us who were Vietnam veterans, we all have a view that says, if you're going to put us into something, then you owe the armed forces, you owe the American people a clear statement of what political objective you're trying to achieve.
While Colin Powell left for Washington to organize troops to defend Saudi Arabia, Brent Scowcroft stayed at Camp David with the president to persuade the Saudis to accept the troops. The next afternoon, the president returned to the White House. The general still hoped talk of liberating Kuwait had gone away, leaving America committed only to the defense of Saudi Arabia.
He motioned me to come out, so I went out there, and he said, what's going on, what have we heard? And what I essentially reported was that there had been zero progress.
This will not stand. This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait.
On live television, the generals watched the president commit the United States to liberating Kuwait.
I've got to go. I have to go to work. I got to go to work.
I liked it. I liked it very much. Others Colin Powell says, that'll teach us to leave you up at Camp David alone with him.
Satellites now showed 2 Iraqi divisions on the Saudi border. The CIA reported the Saudis were considering buying Saddam off. If the Iraqis attacked Saudi Arabia's ports, Saddam would control yet another fifth of the world's oil.
I asked the Saudi ambassador to come in, and he said that the Saudis weren't at all sure they wanted to be helped by the United States. And he cited a couple of examples where the United States had offered help and then demonstrated enormous weakness. And he said, frankly, we're afraid you say you'll help and then the going will get tough and you'll pull out and we'll be left.
The president dispatched his defense secretary to Saudi Arabia. Dick Cheney and his high-level delegation had to convince Saudi Arabia's rulers it might soon be another Kuwait. They met with the king.
I told King Fahd that they did not have the luxury of waiting until Saddam began an invasion of Saudi Arabia and then asked for our help, because then it would be too late.
When Norm Schwarzkopf started laying out what we were prepared to send to Saudi Arabia, beginning with 200,000 troops, I just had the sense that Fahd was absolutely stunned.
At the end of that discussion, the king turned and said, okay. And I almost fell out of my chair because I absolutely was sitting there thinking, well, you know, this is going to be, thank you very much for the information, we'll let you know. And the king said, okay. And I think we all did a double take and went back and said, you know, Secretary Cheney said, so you agree? And the king said, yes, I agree. We walked out of a meeting and I said to Secretary Cheney, I said, sir, I'm prepared to start the flow now. Do you want me to do that? And Secretary Cheney said, yes. And so I turned to Chuck and I said, Chuck, send them on their way.
The largest single movement of troops since World War II began. The president emphasized it was to defend Saudi Arabia, not to liberate Kuwait. The first American aircraft refueled above the Saudi desert. Saddam Hussein had never expected to see forces from America, the great ally of Israel, operating from Arab soil. But the invasion had turned both Western and Arab governments against Iraq. Soon, British, French, and Egyptian troops arrived, the beginnings of a coalition of 30 countries. Iraq's intelligence chief warned if war began, Iraq would lose. Saddam was furious.
None of us dared say withdraw from Kuwait. None of us. Saddam said, you're acting as if you're salesman for Western arms and technology. If it's God's will, victory will be ours.
Saddam rounded up foreigners in Kuwait as hostages. He hoped to intimidate the British and American publics. But his encounter with 7-year-old Stuart Lockwood served only to inflame them.
Yes.
Stuart and Halib.
Does Stuart get his milk?
Yes, he does.
Saddam ruled Kuwait, as he'd always ruled Iraq, with terror. The UN imposed sanctions and called on Saddam to withdraw. Instead, he sent 250,000 soldiers into Kuwait. Kuwait's wealth was systematically plundered. At one hospital, premature babies were left to die as soldiers looted incubators for Iraqi hospitals. Some Kuwaitis tried to fight back. But after the car bombs came reprisals.
They started killing Iraqi soldiers, kidnapping them and killing them. Saddam gave an order to attack any area from which a single shot was fired, so that's what we did.
The fledgling resistance movement was soon broken. The methods used allowed Bush to elevate the struggle into a moral crusade.
Summary executions, routine torture, Hitler revisited. America will not stand aside. The world will not allow the strong to swallow up the weak.
Saddam Hussein paid his first visit to Kuwait. George Bush had authorized the CIA to start recruiting Iraqi dissidents to overthrow him. America's equivalent of the SAS, Delta Force, was on standby to go into Iraq and kidnap him. But Saddam's security was too good. President Bush moved closer to war. He met Mikhail Gorbachev to ask the Soviet Union not to stand in the way if America went to war with Iraq. Iraq was an old ally of the Soviet Union, but Gorbachev agreed. The Cold War had just ended. Gorbachev did not want to risk his relationship with America.
Very good. Thank you.
This was a key meeting. A country had been occupied. If at that point in history we had not been able to deal with that situation, everything else we had worked for would have been null and void.
Without the Soviet Union on board, we never would have been able to marshal the international coalition that we were able to build up. It just gave a completely different dynamic to the whole effort. Instead of being an effort, let's say, by the United States and the United Kingdom to eject Iraq from Kuwait, it was an effort by the entire international community.
But Gorbachev wasn't willing to write a blank check. He added an important proviso.
We agreed with all the Security Council resolutions. We would do everything possible to force Iraq to accept them. We did not rule out the use of military force as a final resort, but all of us must search for a political settlement to avoid war.
С тем, чтобы не довести все-таки до военного конфликта.
This is U.S. Navy warship, Channel 14. Can you tell us what country your flag does under?
The need to bind the Soviets into the coalition dominated American tactics during the first flashpoint. 2 Iraqi tankers tried to sneak past 50 warships from 12 countries enforcing United Nations sanctions. At the President's holiday home in Maine, a crisis meeting. From London, Mrs. Thatcher argued the tankers should be sunk, but the President sided with the Soviet request to backpedal.
The President decided that we would let the ships go, and so he called Prime Minister Thatcher to tell her that, and she says, "Well, George, all right, I'll accede to this one, but this is no time to go wobbly."
A week later, King Hussein of Jordan came to seek British support for a face-saving deal for Saddam. The king was an old ally of the West, but he was also close to Saddam. He feared a war would engulf Jordan. Mrs. Thatcher was implacable.
The meeting started with my speaking to her of my views and my attempts and my frustrations, and then she was very quiet for a long period of time, and then she gave me her responses.
He walked into a firestorm. She flew at him. She said that she thought he had calculated entirely wrongly. He had made the wrong decision by encouraging Iraq, by appearing to support Iraq. She gave him the toughest time I think he's ever had in his life.
I had to ask a question. Was it conceivable that you could ever be wrong?
Look, I was not discourteous. I was firm, very firm indeed.
But in Washington, there was division. The CIA, like British intelligence, reported sanctions might take 5 years to liberate Kuwait. The president began to see war as inevitable. But America's top general had grave misgivings. Colin Powell went to the White House to explain how long-term sanctions might work.
I laid out for him what a sanctions policy might look like and how it would work. He listened intently in that way he has, somewhat slouched in his chair with his chin slightly down. And his response was, well, Colin, that's all very, very interesting. It's good to consider all options, but I just don't think we're going to have time for sanctions to work.
But even after this meeting, Colin Powell would continue to argue against his president's line. 2 weeks later, in the Pentagon, Powell spoke with a top British commander.
Colin Powell said to me that he would be prepared to give sanctions a considerable time to work. And I said, well, how long are we talking about? To my astonishment, Colin Powell said, well, I would give them up to 2 years to work. He said, I don't think we should mount a military operation for at least that length of time, if that's what it takes for the sanctions to work, which he was confident that they would, because he felt there was a real risk of perhaps winning the war, but losing the peace in the Middle East.
The president and his generals were on a collision course. In the desert, under appalling conditions, were troops from America, Britain, France, and the Arab coalition. They couldn't stay indefinitely. The president feared his coalition might collapse before Saddam's determination buckled. He told the generals to brief him on how they would take back Kuwait. It was an order that infuriated Norman Schwarzkopf. The troops he commanded had been sent to defend Saudi Arabia.
Everybody's saving lots of money right now, sir. No kidding.
Schwarzkopf believed there weren't enough of them to storm Kuwait's defenses and defeat an army of occupation which outnumbered them 2 to 1. He feared Bush's impatience might lead to military disaster.
They're great, aren't they? Colin called me and said, I want you to send an offensive option back. And I objected strongly. I said, look, I've told everybody all along we do not have the forces on the ground to conduct an offensive option.
My view was, well, that's all right, it's a work in progress. Bring it back to the United States, let us brief it, and we'll all see where we are.
Only 3 days later, Schwarzkopf's chief planner, Lieutenant Colonel Joe Purvis, was sent to brief the president and his aides. To Purvis, it was obvious the best option was to outflank the Iraqi defenses. But he and Schwarzkopf believed there were only enough troops to attack head-on. The computers predicted 10,000 casualties.
My first question is, why don't you go around to the west? And the answer was, well, we don't have enough gas trucks. We'll run out of gas when we're up there on the shoulder. We can't do that. It's not a feasible option. And maybe something, we don't know what kind of sand there is or something, but I was pretty appalled.
The military were saying, here's the way we'd have to do it in a manner that would suggest extraordinary number of casualties and a large price to pay.
This was an effort, however conscious or unconscious, to basically say, this is going to be a near-run thing, and the casualties are going to be very high, and maybe we ought not do this. I think that there was very little enthusiasm in the American military for, in fact, throwing Saddam out of Kuwait militarily.
I wasn't trying to frighten them. I wanted to make sure they understood the significance of the operation we were thinking about. This wasn't going to be just a simple walk in the woods, drop a few bombs and they'll all go home, the way the Egyptians and the Saudis and the Turks were telling my political colleagues. And these were all gentlemen who had never really been in a major war. And so what I was trying to do is make sure they understood what we were doing and the difficulties of what we were doing, especially when it came to a ground plan. And I think the ground plan is what scared them all to death.
That night there was a crisis of confidence at the heart of the administration. The politicians wondered if the right generals were in command. Colin Powell rushed to Saudi Arabia to meet Schwarzkopf. They knew that back in Washington, Dick Cheney was forming his own team to plan an offensive in case they dragged their feet. Schwarzkopf laid out what he believed was needed if the president wanted war. He asked Powell to support him.
When Colin came over for his briefing, I pointed out all of my trepidations And the conclusion of that was Colin said, okay, if you are going to be required to attack, you will have the forces that you need. That was very reassuring to me.
Colin Powell returned to the White House.
So, Mr. President, if you direct us to attack in order to eject the Iraqi army out of Kuwait, this is how we're going to do it.
They asked for the 7th Corps, the 2 heaviest divisions in the American Army out of Europe, which totally weakened NATO. They asked for 6 carrier battle groups. And then the political poison pill, they asked for the activation of the National Guard and the Army Reserves. The force represented in these 3 requests was just awesome, overwhelming, not to mention the cost. The President pushed his chair back, said, you've got it, and if you need more, come see me.
I left that meeting after that with a firm decision, no question about it, that sanctions had about 3 months left to produce a result. And if they did not produce a result in 3 months, we were going to war.
I have today directed the Secretary of Defense to increase the size of U.S. forces committed to Desert Shield to ensure that the coalition has an adequate offensive military option should that be necessary to achieve our common goals.
The American army that would have fought World War III against the Soviet Union was on the move. 250,000 American troops headed for the Gulf. Britain sent a further 20,000. Margaret Thatcher's last act as Prime Minister. Bush had dragged his reluctant generals to the brink of war. He had assembled international support. Now, he had to convince the American public and the Congress. Bush's political opponents in the Congress began to sense public opinion would not stand for war.
There was very little public support in the United States for the idea of going to war in the Persian Gulf.
Some people never get the word. The fight isn't about oil. The fight is about naked aggression that will not stand.
If we were going to fight a war, we had to do so with the support of the American people. If possible, with the support of the American Congress. But that if we were going to send people, Americans, off to die in the Persian Gulf, we had to be able to survive the judgments of history, that we didn't do so precipitously.
The United Nations gave Iraq 6 weeks to withdraw. After that, coalition forces would go to war. In America, opposition on the streets and in Congress intensified. It looked like Vietnam all over again. The morning after the UN decision, the President risked an about-face to win the political battle.
To go the extra mile for peace, I will issue an invitation to Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz to come to Washington. I'm asking Secretary Jim Baker to go to Baghdad to see Saddam Hussein.
The President had not consulted his allies. They were furious.
It seemed to be entirely the wrong signal. It seemed it would sort of give the Iraqis the impression that it could all be negotiated, that anything was possible, there was no need to withdraw.
Just 6 days before the UN deadline for war, and after many changes of plan, James Baker prepared to meet Tariq Aziz. The Americans needed the talks to win over public opinion and a hostile Congress. But they feared the Iraqis might offer a deal that would split the coalition.
If there is a genuine, sincere, serious intention to make peace in the whole region of the Middle East, we are ready to reciprocate. When I went to meet with James Baker, I hadn't the slightest idea that that meeting would succeed. I knew that that was public relations, that he wanted to tell the Congress, look, to the end I tried to find a diplomatic settlement so that he could get few more votes.
Baker carried a letter from President Bush to the Iraqi leader demanding withdrawal and reminding Saddam that America had nuclear weapons.
Thank you, everyone. The president's letter to Saddam Hussein, which Tariq Aziz read in Geneva, made it very clear that if Iraq used weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, against United States forces, that the American people would demand vengeance, and that we had the means to achieve it.
I read it very carefully. And then when I ended reading it, I told him, look, Mr. Secretary, this is not the kind of correspondence between two heads of state. This is a letter of threat, and I cannot receive from you a letter of threat to my president, and I returned it to him.
In Washington, the president and his team could only wait.
We basically said, what if Saddam proposes this? What if he proposes a partial pullback? What if he actually does a partial pullback and promises a complete pullback? What we did was we must have gamed out 10 different Iraqi scenarios that we thought would test the coalition.
And I could never figure out why he didn't do it. He could have just given us fits. And that was what I was worried about happening as a result of a meeting like this.
But in Geneva, Tariq Aziz offered no last-minute compromise. Instead, the talk had turned to war.
I said that they should not make the mistake of assuming that they would control the terms of the battle, as perhaps they might have assumed in their war with Iran, that this would be a totally different situation, that our technological superiority was overwhelming and would be brought to bear.
My response was very cool. I told him, Mr. Secretary, Iraq is a very ancient nation. We have lived for 6,000 years. I have no doubts that you are a very powerful nation. I have no doubts that you have a very strong military machine, and you will inflict on us heavy losses, but Iraq will survive. And this leadership will decide the future of Iraq.
And I was certain at the time that we would be going to war, and going to war very, very soon.
The talks had lasted over 6 hours. Across the world, people waited expectantly to hear if there would be peace or war.
Regrettably, ladies and gentlemen, in over 6 hours, I heard nothing that suggested to me any Iraqi flexibility whatsoever.
Even to this day, I am stunned by Saddam's failure to exploit all of his options. Time and time again, Saddam, by opting for the maximum, actually made it relatively, I hate to use the word easy, but made it much less difficult on the United States and the coalition to sustain itself. And, you know, I'm not sure at times so much whether we won it, but clearly he lost it.
Now, Congress began to debate whether to give authority for war, something they'd never done over Vietnam. No one knew how the vote would go. For 3 days, they debated. Everything hung in the balance. If Bush lost but tried to go to war, he risked impeachment.
On this vote, the yeas are 52, and the nays are 47.
We would not have won the vote without Geneva. We simply wouldn't. In the aftermath of the Geneva meeting, opposition to our use of force eroded. So it was an idea that germinated with the president. It was the right idea. We did it right, and there really should be no second thoughts about that. It worked exactly the way it should have worked.
President Bush had taken America and its allies to the eve of war. The war would be fought to stop Saddam keeping control of 20% of the world's oil. But Bush also believed this would be a just war against a dangerous dictator.
The president, privately, with the most inner circle, made absolutely clear he was going to go forward with this action, even if he were impeached. The truth of the matter is that while public opinion and the voice of Congress was important to Bush, I believe it had no impact on his decision about what he would do. He was going to throw that son of a bitch out of Kuwait regardless of whether the Congress or the public supported him.
7 days after the Geneva peace talks, stealth bombers left for Baghdad. The Gulf War was about to begin. In the final hours before the United Nations deadline to withdraw from Kuwait, Baghdad prepared for war. Saddam Hussein appeared on television to assure the Iraqi people victory would be theirs. Talk of retreat was punished by death. You are the new leader of the Arab world, he was told. Saddam laid out his strategy. The Americans and British, he said, rely too much on technology. They never fight man to man. They can never win the battle. Across America and Europe, midnight vigils marked the passing of the deadline. Many feared a long and bloody war, another quagmire like Vietnam. At dawn, the president signed the order that would take the coalition to war.
He was ordering people into situations where they would lose their lives, and the kind of magnitude of that awful decision, I think, haunted him. You know, how much is a life worth? How much is 100 lives worth? 1,000, 10,000.
1,700 coalition aircraft now prepared to attack. They faced modern Iraqi fighters, hundreds of missile batteries, and thousands of anti-aircraft guns. Some Pentagon estimates had suggested 1 in 5 aircraft in the first attack might be shot down. The American air planners hoped the attacks would be precise and powerful enough to bring Iraq to its knees. To begin with, the army occupying Kuwait would hardly be touched. Instead, strategic targets all over Iraq would be obliterated. Before the planes could attack, a unit known as Task Force Normandy had a critical role. Its Apache helicopter crews had been training for months. Their mission, to destroy at all costs 2 radar sites that could give Baghdad early warning of what was to come. It was a moonless night. 8 Apache helicopters laden with Hellfire missiles took off towards Iraq. This is a pilot's eye view, video from one helicopter's night vision camera. The gunships flew a few feet off the ground until they were 8 miles from the radar dishes.
We slowed our airspeed to about 40 knots, came up on line, all abreast, so we're all at the same distance from the target. And at this point, I'm not looking through my goggles, I'm looking at a TV screen right in front of me. Watched the clock tick to 0. I gave the code word, get some. At that point, everybody fired their Hellfires.
Okay, did you get the,
Out of the probably 150 people that we were briefed were at the site. I would imagine not more than 10 or 20 probably lived through that engagement.
Time to launch, 1 minute, sir.
Off the coast, the US Navy prepared to launch dozens of cruise missiles. But the missiles couldn't navigate over featureless desert, so they were secretly programmed to fly over the mountains of Iran and then turn towards Baghdad.
050. Attack 48 east.
The Iranians had no idea of any of this. The Navy commander prayed nothing would go wrong.
We were dealing with neighboring countries who we didn't want to join into the fray. We'd never used them in conflict before, and there was a lot of apprehension about, do we launch these things and then they make up their own mind where they're going?
In Baghdad, the guns began to fire. 10 stealth bombers were minutes away. They were designed to be invisible to radar, but as insurance, the US Air Force started to jam Baghdad's radar. The jamming gave the game away. The defenders' radar screens were blinded, but 3,000 anti-aircraft guns and 60 missile batteries fired wildly into the sky.
That night, orders came from headquarters to fire back any way we could, even if it meant closing our eyes and firing into the sky. It was so dark, and the aircraft were coming so quickly, and we didn't have the capability to aim accurately. That's why they told us, put up a barrage of fire any way you can.
In the approaching stealth bombers, the pilots saw the firestorm of shells and missiles exploding above the city. They flew straight towards it.
What we wanted to do was sever his ability to communicate with his frontline forces. And if that meant killing him, then so be it.
Holy cow. That was a large airburst that we saw. It was filling the sky. And I think, John, that airburst took out the telecommunications.
CNN journalists gave a running commentary to the outside world. 6 minutes after the stealth bombers left, the cruise missiles arrived. Some destroyed government buildings. Others dropped carbon filament to short the electrical grid system. With the initial attacks complete, an armada of coalition aircraft headed for targets all over Iraq. Hundreds of planes took to the air. Despite the initial successes, scores were expected not to return. As the battle unfolded, Norman Schwarzkopf sent a message to his troops.
Soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, this morning at 0300, we launched Operation Desert Storm. My confidence in you is total. Our cause is just. Now, you must be the thunder and lightning of Desert Storm. Planes were in the air at that time, heading towards their targets, with no guarantees of the outcome. to know that we had taken a very big step and that the war had started and none of us knew exactly how it was going to end. It's a very, very emotional moment.
With key air defense headquarters destroyed, Iraqi fighters couldn't operate. Only a few managed to struggle into the air.
Our fighter aircraft had orders to attack, but who? The radar was blank.
The first Iraqi fighter of the war was shot down.
And I see that somebody's targeted on me. It's an Iraqi fighter who wants to target me and shoot me down. And so I remember firing a missile. I remember seeing this big blue flame coming across the sky, 3 to 5 seconds long. And I remember seeing it, and then it goes away. I remember thinking to myself that my missile hit him and that the target's destroyed and that he's down, but what's ahead?
AWACS planes, Boeing 707s packed with computer equipment, helped control the battle. The coalition armada systematically attacked Iraq's war machine, the factories that made chemical and biological weapons, the Scud missile plants. In all, that night, over 200 different targets were hit.
The first 24 hours consisted of more attacks in the master attack plan than the entire number of targets that were targeted in the years 1942 and 1943 during the combined bomber offensive in Europe.
That night marked a new point in warfare. Precision bombing had become a reality. Only one Allied pilot was killed. At the White House, the politicians were euphoric.
The first night of the war, everybody was, in heaven. They saw these strikes go in very successfully. Casualties were almost nil. Television pictures of bombs going down chimney stacks and all that sort of stuff. And some of the reporters were running around saying, this is going to be over right away. And I had to call down to the Pentagon press office and tell them, shut those guys up. We have just started a war. It isn't a one-day affair. It's not going to be over before the next commercial break.
Just before dawn, the RAF attacked an airbase near Basra, Iraq's second city. Lacking American technology, for years the RAF had trained to surprise the enemy by flying low and fast. It was not a tactic they'd had the chance to use on a modern battlefield.
Out there it was burning blue. I mean, it was probably 8 o'clock in the morning, at 8:30, and it was blue sky and the visibility was 1,000 miles.
We were flying at maybe 60 or 70 feet and about 500 or 600 miles an hour, and there's this huge explosion and a flash, and the aircraft was hit by a missile.
Where I had blue above my head, suddenly the desert was above my head and it was just tumbling.
I couldn't see the back of the aircraft. All it was a ball of fire, and the fire was spreading its way down the spine of the aircraft towards me.
And then you say, this aircraft is going no further. And then you go, give me the ejection drills,
It's actually half a second between pulling the handle and being thrown clear of the aircraft, and that half a second's like a lifetime.
And then it's as if someone, a huge giant, just grabs you by the shoulder, yanks you up, and I remember my head going forward.
And then there's the crack as the canopy opens, and you're left in your parachute. And it's deathly silent, and there we were about to land in the desert in Iraq.
And then you realise how big the desert is, and how clear the sky is.
We'd gone from these modern-day nights on our high-tech Chargers, flashing around the sky in £20 million worth of technology, and suddenly there we were, two very sad pink bodies in the desert.
Then, after about 3 hours, we saw some Iraqis coming towards us.
And shots started to ring out, and they were shooting at us, they were trying to kill us.
And we were down low, and I can't see it, and I remember John looking at them here as we were down, and going, should we go out with a bang? And I don't know why, I just said, no, there's always hope.
Saddam Hussein was moving between safe houses in the suburbs. The bombing had been destructive, but hadn't inflicted the civilian deaths Saddam had judged would outrage world opinion. His former intelligence chief says when he briefed Saddam on the situation, his temper flared.
I said, I know that Iraq will be destroyed. I am telling you the truth. Saddam said, these Americans are technicians, not soldiers who fight. They have technology on their side, but that won't help them win.
Saddam had already planned where to strike back. That morning, when he met his ministers, he ordered action he believed would shatter the coalition of Western and Arab countries attacking Iraq. Mobile launchers hidden in the desert fired Scud missiles at Israel.
We had the capability, we did it. When you are attacked by an enemy, you attack your enemies. That's natural.
The Scuds were fired indiscriminately at Israel's largest city. Saddam judged the Israelis would retaliate and join the conflict. The Arabs in the coalition would then refuse to fight alongside Israel. The coalition would collapse, and so would the war. Soon more Scuds were on the way. Israel's nuclear forces now went on full alert. 60 Israeli jets took to the skies. Early warning radar appeared to show Iraqi bombers heading for Israel. The American Defense Secretary picked up the hotline to Tel Aviv. Israeli retaliation seemed inevitable.
You can imagine an American president sitting quietly as missiles land on the United States saying, no, we're not going to do anything. I mean, that's an unacceptable political position for any government.
The Israeli army reported nerve gas in the debris of one of the missiles. Israelis prepared for the worst.
We knew we had a real problem at this point, because if Israel got into the war, this was a real break for Saddam. If he provoked the Israelis into attacking him, then the chances of holding the coalition together really became problematical.
I must say that this is the darnest way to conduct an interview.
Ultimately, none of the 8 Scuds that landed that night proved to have chemical warheads.
The kind of threat we're facing.
After some discussion, Baghdad had decided the Israelis might retaliate against a chemical attack with nuclear weapons.
Actions that are necessary to remove it.
أكيد بأن قسما من الصواريخ سكود كان. Some of the Scud missiles were loaded with chemical warheads, but they weren't used. They were kept hidden throughout the war. We didn't use them because the other side had a deterrent force.
The man who decided what happened next was Israel's Prime Minister, Yitzhak Shamir. He and George Bush disliked each other, but now Bush telephoned him. An angry Shamir told the president if America couldn't stop the Scuds, the Israeli Air Force would.
Bush said to Shamir, pleaded with Shamir, tried to cajole Shamir that Israel not take any military action, that this would be injurious to the cause to the Allied cause, that in the final analysis this would also be injurious to Israel's cause.
I think in such situations you have not to play with words. It couldn't be a moment of diplomatic discussions and debates. And well, I explained to him, it's very difficult, Mr. President, it's very difficult. I don't know what the day of tomorrow will bring, but at this moment, we will act accordingly, accordingly with new concepts.
Israel became the president's top priority.
We were going to be redoubling our efforts, and the darndest search and destroy effort that's ever been undertaken out in that area, and I hope that is very reassuring to the citizens of Israel.
But Norman Schwarzkopf believed the Air Force should concentrate on winning the war, not placating the Israelis. He was furious at Washington's interference.
He called them pointy-headed politicians who had never fought their way out of a wet paper bag.
From my perspective, from the strategic perspective, and the President's perspective, and obviously I was doing this with the President's approval, it was vital to keep the Israelis out of the conflict. And that the way you did that was to make certain that they knew we were doing everything humanly possible to deal with that Scud threat.
Cheney overruled Schwarzkopf. Aircraft started to crisscross 28,000 square miles of desert, hunting for perhaps 14 mobile Scud launchers. They couldn't find them. Neither could they find the convoys bringing supplies of fresh missiles.
They used to transport the Scuds to us in civilian buses. They'd take out all the seats and slide a missile in through the back. Even if the bus was spotted by an enemy plane, the pilot would assume it was just full of passengers.
But there was another way to hunt Scuds. SAS columns were fighting deep inside Iraq. Schwarzkopf distrusted special forces. But 5 days before, the SAS commander had persuaded him to make an exception.
There had to be people on the ground. The human eye cannot be replaced by technology. We were well armed, we had good strength, we above all had the desert as our friend to retreat and hide into. We were told in very categoric terms that our priorities 1 to 10 were Scud, Scud, and nothing but Scud.
For 43 days, the SAS patrolled the Iraqi desert closest to Israel. They called it the Scud Box. This is the only film of an SAS column. It was taken by the gun camera on an American helicopter flying in to take back a prisoner. Within 2 days of the SAS arriving, there were no more launches from the Scud Box. Columns like this caused mayhem, destroying radar sites, microwave towers, and cutting communication cables. And when they saw Scud convoys, they attacked them. America had rushed Patriot missiles to Israel and Saudi Arabia to shoot down Scuds. In the skies above Tel Aviv and Riyadh, they dueled with the incoming missiles. The Patriots got as close as they could and detonated, filling the air with shrapnel. In Israel, the Patriot became a symbol of resistance, damping down the pressure for Israel to join the war.
Patriot is 41 for 42. 42 Scuds engaged, 41 intercepted. I view it as an honor to be here, to come to Raytheon, the home of the men and women who built the Scud Busters. We're very...
But the Pentagon was claiming a kill every time a Patriot exploded near a Scud. Senior British intelligence officers didn't believe the figures, and neither did the Israelis. On the ground in Tel Aviv, the Israeli military analyzed the damage every time a Scud fell to earth. What they concluded was kept top secret so as not to give comfort to Saddam Hussein.
When I met President Bush in Washington, we started some human argument because he was convinced that Patriots were doing a great job. I told him that at the very best, the intercept ratio maybe was 20% intercept probability. He asked me what I meant by that, and I said that maybe out of every 10 Scuds Patriots tried to intercept, they might succeed with 2. But in retrospect, I was overstating the case. I think that probably not a single Scud was intercepted by Patriot.
The Patriots struggled to react to Scud missiles traveling at 6 times the speed of sound. The myth of the Patriot helped keep Israel out of the war, but most of the Scud warheads got through.
Going to the ground, gonna get an impact.
Only after the war did the Pentagon acknowledge the Patriot's limitations.
Patriot was an air defense system designed to shoot down aircraft, not missiles. Again, what I remind everybody, all my friends in the United States who think we've got defenses against missiles, we don't.
Tel Aviv was targeted by Scud missiles fired from western Iraq. Fresh missiles were brought to the launchers along these desert roads. SAS men hit along them. One 8-man patrol was codenamed Bravo 20.
Bravo 20 was tasked to insert into Iraq some 300 kilometers by helicopter to set an observation post up in the hope of seeing mobile Scud launchers driving past and then communicate back to base and call in coalition aircraft.
The main supply route wasn't a tarmacked road, it was a track system. And as I looked northeast, there were 2 S-60 anti-aircraft guns. We got enemy right on top of us. It was about mid-afternoon on the second day, and we started to hear goats coming from the north. And then we heard the young boy start to come along and shout at his goats. And his eyes come up like saucers. He knew there was something wrong. And straight away just went running off towards the anti-aircraft guns, just screaming and shouting.
We packed all our equipment up and started to move out of the Wadi. Within half an hour, we were engaged by a local militia force and a firefight ensued.
We first heard that Bravo 20 was in trouble when we got a garbled radio message. We really didn't know what had gone wrong. We launched our helicopters, and as it turned out, we were looking further south than they actually were.
The patrol had become scattered. McNabb led one group of 5 men. It started snowing.
It was plain to see if the weather don't kill us, the enemy will. And we were continuously getting compromised by these goats. The whole land was covered with people herding goats. So I made the decision that we're going to hijack a vehicle that night and go for the border.
McNabb and the 4 men with him did just that. But close to the border, in a series of gun battles, 2 died. The others were hunted down.
I decided to hide in a drainage culvert about 4 kilometers from the Syrian border. I have no idea what happened, but it was just chaotic sort of shooting. So I knew I was in the shit. As I was pulled out, it was the first time I'd been out in daylight. Beautiful sunny day, and you could see Syria. You could see the high ground of Syria, which was severely pissed me off because you were so close you could literally taste it, you know. And that was it, I was captured.
Meanwhile, the other 3 patrol members had started walking to Syria. The cold killed 1 man, another was captured, the 3rd reached the border.
It was night. I started to move around the edge of a building. A guy came out about 200 meters away. He saw me. I hid behind a mound. 2 guys started to walk down. I could possibly bluff it by letting them walk past me. As it was, they came right on top of me. I took the first guy out with a knife. The second guy started to run. I caught up with him, and we grappled on the floor, and he ended up with a broken neck. On the last night, when I started to collapse, I knew I was getting very, very close to dying at that point. I knew I had to get water. There was a goat herder's house. I staggered up there. A young guy came out and greeted me. I asked if this was Iraq. He then said Syria. He pointed back and showed me where Iraq was and assured me that I was safe.
The bombing of Iraq continued. The RAF was having a difficult war. In these early days, its losses accounted for 1/4 of the coalition's total casualties. The crew's life expectancy could be measured in weeks.
Whatever reasons may have been given after the war, the reason those aircraft crashed was because they were flying low level, for one reason or another. It may have been they flew into the ground, it may have been they were hit by flak, it may be they were avoiding flak, but they were flying low level. And so one said, well, is this necessary? Is this a sensible thing to do? And the answer was, no, it isn't necessary, and it's not a sensible thing to do, and I don't want to go on doing it.
The American command admired the men, but were dubious about the tactics. They would happily have cancelled missions against airfields the Iraqis were not even attempting to use. The crews also suggested a change of tactics, but it didn't happen.
It was going to impact on the whole of the RAF's strategy and put it into question. And as a result of that, there was a great reluctance in the MOD for it to change, and we weren't allowed to change it. The commanders on spot were forbidden to change it.
Shrapnel has gone through here and has gone out through the top of the wing.
Only after another tornado was lost, and with sharp questions being asked by the Americans, did the low-level attacks stop.
I think it was quite disgraceful interference by the Ministry of Defence in the tactics, not the policy, not the strategy of the war, the tactics of running that war.
Aging Buccaneer jets, the aircraft the tornado was meant to replace, rushed to the Gulf. They carried equipment to laser designate targets from higher altitudes.
Splash. That was an excellent splash.
Soon they were working in tandem with tornadoes, dropping laser-guided bombs. A week into the war, the air planners still believed by bombing Iraq they could deliver a decisive victory. Much of Iraq's air force had been destroyed on the ground. The coalition controlled the skies. It could bomb at will. Bridges, power plants, communications, all were destroyed. But Saddam did not withdraw from Kuwait. He was determined to sit the bombing out.
He would say, it's no problem. We can rebuild everything, even the morale of the people.
You could sense the angst and anxiety and unease throughout the American body politic. Gosh, it's been going on for a week. Why isn't it over? Maybe it's not going well. What are we trying to do? And we had not been sort of on stage to explain what we were trying to do. So I went up to see Secretary Cheney and said to the Secretary, we've got to do something because this is, we're starting to lose the public on this one.
Secretary Cheney and General Powell are here to...
The fear the American public might turn against the military, as they had over Vietnam, influenced Powell's thinking throughout the war.
And then General Powell...
Public relations was the war's second front.
As a measure of effectiveness of how we're doing in the air campaign, I just pull these two things out. I've laundered them so you can't really tell what I'm talking about because I don't want the Iraqis to know what I'm talking about. But trust me, trust me.
Officially, Saddam was not a target. But the Allies launched 260 missions against sites where they thought he might be hiding. Eventually, spies reported Saddam slept in private houses, changing location every night.
You can find out perhaps where he has been. You can find out even where he is. But what you need to know is where he's going to be because you must mount an attack. And so it's almost an impossible task.
You might find it strange, but the President of the Republic of Iraq was sometimes driven around the city in an old taxi. It's strange but true that Saddam also used a lorry to move around the city. These are some of the measures he resorted to.
The Air Force kept searching. These pictures prompted some of the more improbable missions of the war. Saddam was inside an American motorhome known as a Winnebago.
When we saw him sitting in a Winnebago, we went after the Winnebagos with a vengeance, and whenever we saw one or tried to find one, and whenever we saw one or two or three, we would attack them as quickly as we possibly could.
Iraqi soldiers in Kuwait opened a pipeline flooding the Gulf with oil. The aim was to destroy the desalination plants that provided Saudi Arabia with drinking water. Saddam wanted to provoke an early land war and inflict casualties to undermine Western resolve. The desalination plants continued to work, and a bombing raid cut the flow of oil. If the Iraqis wanted a ground war, they would have to attack. Saddam ordered his forces to move on the abandoned Saudi border town of Khafji.
Saddam said, capture 4,000 or 5,000 American, British and French troops. We'll use them as human shields. We'll tie them to our tanks and overrun the Saudi oil wells. If we do this, the Allied jets won't attack.
That evening, the U.S. Marines sent an unmanned spy plane on a routine flight over Iraqi positions in southern Kuwait. It beamed back television pictures to a truck at the launch site.
What do we have here? Crow. Let's see what they are. Man, this is something.
The Iraqi attack on Khafji had begun. The town was undefended. It had been evacuated on the first day of the war after the Iraqis shelled it. In the control vehicle, Marine helicopter pilots awaited orders to attack. But the orders never came.
We'd been on the landline back to our wing headquarters, letting them know what was going on. We started, a million and one scenarios began running through our minds on, why in the world would they not be letting us launch on these vehicles?
Guess what? Closer, closer. And 2,253 hours. They've crossed the border. Crossed in Saudi Arabia. King Fahd's going to be pissed. Fahd baby's going to be pissed. He's going to be hot.
For an hour and a half, the Marines watched the Iraqis advance. Back at the Air Force headquarters, the war had settled into a routine. That routine didn't include an Iraqi attack.
Where's our air? This is ridiculous. Frickin' bomber couldn't ask for any better target than that.
Why was the Iraqi advance not stopped prior to Khafji? A very straightforward, simple question deserves a very straightforward, simple answer. It was not the Air Force's best day.
The Iraqis occupied Khafji. They did not know U.S. Marines had hidden in the town. One of the six-man reconnaissance teams was headed by Chuck Ingraham. Lawrence Lentz commanded the other.
I got the team together and I said, we've been practicing for some of us 5 years to play in the big game, and now here we all of a sudden get a chance. I think we ought to stay. And they agreed.
You're the only people there, yourself and another team of your buddies somewhere else in the city. And you know that that's it, the point of no return.
Stand by. I'll just missile, I'll shoot it down range. Take that bad boy out.
Baghdad announced a great victory. But by dawn the next day, American artillery was in position. The Marines inside Khafji gave precise radio instructions telling the guns where to fire.
When I finally got artillery fire, it was the best feeling in the world. Everything we called in was what we call danger close, which simply means that it's so close that the round could actually hit us instead of the enemy.
At every moment, the Marines in the town expected to be discovered.
The Iraqis came very close to capturing us. They were inside of our building for at least a day. You could see their heads down there, and if you wanted to, you could spit on them.
2 days later, Saudi forces formed up to retake their town. The attack would cost them 19 dead. Perhaps 100 Iraqis died in the town. Meanwhile, airstrikes destroyed 2 Iraqi divisions desperately trying to reach Khafji. For months, Saddam had proclaimed fighting on the ground would bleed the coalition and undermine its resolve. But the attempt to reinforce Khafji was a bitter lesson in what air power could do to an army that surrendered control of the air.
كما قلت بأن حالات من التوتر Saddam became tense and anxious, although he tried to conceal it. He was restless. It wasn't so much that he cared about the casualties, but they exasperated him.
The attacks on Baghdad continued. Stealth bombers by night, cruise missiles by day. The missiles used the hotel where foreign journalists stayed as a final position check before heading for their targets. Coalition prisoners were now held in Baghdad.
This character came in, looking at my teeth. You knew that something was going to happen, but you were hoping that maybe it wasn't. It was maybe some stupid, they're doing it for a laugh. But there's nothing you can do. And in fact, what he done, he got like a pliers or a pinchers or whatever they were, and he took the back quarter of the tooth out. I was struggling, I was screaming, and this is a demonstration of what we can do. Do you really think we're going to help you? We can just let you die. There's no problems with this.
They just yanked me up and just karate chopped through and kind of felt like the heel of the boot just into my knee. And I collapsed again and they just pulled me up, smack, pulled me up, smack, pull me up, smack, pull me up, smack. And eventually, and somewhere in there, whilst they're doing that, they say, "Are you pilot or navigator? Are you pilot?" And eventually, pilot. And it just came out. I couldn't stop it. And that's when you realise you've broken to the violence. You feel a desperate sense of failure that you've let everyone down.
هل لديك رسالة؟ Do you have a message?
I thought everyone thought I was a traitor, and that everyone would see that I'd failed, and that was the last image my family was going to see of me.
Terry and Guy, I love you. تم إصابتي بمنظومة عراقية لا أتمكن من تحديد.
Somebody came up and he said, "We're going to execute you, or you can go on TV." And it was a stark choice of, make the broadcast or be killed.
I think this war should be stopped so we can go home. I do not agree on this war with Iraq.
And that was, I think, the ultimate shame. Everything that had gone before paled in insignificance about sitting in front of a TV camera and decrying your country, for want of a better expression.
I'm now going to show you a picture of the luckiest man in Iraq on this particular day. Keep your eye on the crosshairs. Right there. Look at here. Right through the crosshairs.
Coalition superiority was overwhelming, but the airmen were running out of targets.
And now in his rearview mirror.
Late in January, we came to the lower part of the list, and one of those targets that we hadn't been able to get to before, because it wasn't high priority, was a bunker in the Al-Fridus area of Baghdad.
2 stealth bombers were eventually assigned to attack this target. Days before, a spy in Baghdad had reported Iraqi intelligence was using the bunker. The bunker was a public air raid shelter. 204 people, many women and children, had died. The shelters were the only places with running water and electricity. So each night, families gathered in them.
It was pretty far down the list of command and control sites, near the bottom. And in fact, I recall when Buster and I were in the car driving down to our evening meeting with General Schwarzkopf, where we'd go over the targets we were going to hit 2 days hence. He and I talked about it, and we kind of concluded that we were getting into sort of the marginal targets in the Baghdad area. We wondered momentarily if, in fact, there was some sort of a propaganda ploy. These people were Kurds that Saddam Hussein had murdered and then put in there, things like that. But it was obvious that, in fact, it was being used as an air raid shelter.
If the Allies had known about the civilians, the shelter would not have been bombed. But the Pentagon has always insisted the Iraqi intelligence service that monitored dissidents also used the building. Baghdad denies this. Wafiq al-Samurai says he visited the shelter.
Part
of the shelter was used by the intelligence service. There were different groups, but mostly they were people from what was called the Technical Affairs Department. They would often go in and out of the bunker. On one occasion, Saddam himself went there.
The Alfredo bunker hit gave us a major public relations and political problem. I mean, it stopped everything we were doing for about a day and a half while we paid our attention to that. And so after that, I called General Schwarzkopf and we talked about it. I said, Norm, clearly we did what we thought was right, but it turned out to be full of civilians. We've got to look at the target list a little more closely. And we got to take a look at what it is we're doing in Baghdad itself. We didn't shut down all targets in Baghdad, but I asked questions like, why are we bombing the Ba'ath Party headquarters for the 8th time? Do we think there is somebody still in the Ba'ath Party headquarters? Why are we bouncing rubble with million-dollar missiles?
The bombing campaign had crippled Iraq, but Saddam was still in power and his troops still in Kuwait. It was clear that air power alone could not win the war.
How much more hitting of strategic targets in Baghdad would have caused Saddam Hussein to move his forces out of the desert? Let's get real. Ultimately, if you want to gain Kuwait back, and if you want to do what the United Nations charged us to do, you gotta go on the ground and take it back.
On the ground, 500,000 American, British, French, and Arab troops moved to their final positions. The ground attack to liberate Kuwait would begin in 11 days. A ferocious air campaign was still paving the way for the liberation of Kuwait. That night's target was an intelligence headquarters. The Allies didn't realize British prisoners were inside it. Despite the destruction, Saddam Hussein was defiant. To liberate Kuwait, the Allies would have to attack on the ground.
The president said, now, Cole and you, Norm, are really sure that air power alone can't do it. And my response was, Mr. President, I wish to God that I could assure you that air power alone could do it. But you can't take that chance.
Now all eyes were on Norman Schwarzkopf. In the days before the ground attack, he was haunted by the fear of massive casualties. Schwarzkopf was under pressure. His explosions of temper were common knowledge.
Working with Norm Schwarzkopf was sort of like watching a thermometer. The blood would start around the shirt collar, and then it would work its way up to the jawline and then to the ears. And by the time it got to the ears, you ought to watch out.
I would say that working for General Schwarzkopf was a privilege and an honor, but there were many times when if someone had asked me if I would rather have been in that war room or in the dental chair
having a root canal without anesthesia, I probably would have chosen the dental chair.
Schwarzkopf's staff feared him. The British watched in amazement.
Norman going ballistic put people off their jobs and took their eye off the ball. But on the upside, he was a brilliant military strategist with a lot of experience. He understood the Arabs and the Arab world, and he was a great diplomat and was able to bring nations along and foreign armies along in a way that a lesser man would not have been able to.
When human lives are on the line, you cannot be cavalier. You can't do enough. You cannot do enough. You must do everything you possibly can and leave no stone unturned, and you can't settle. You can never settle for second best or a second-class solution when you're dealing with enterprises of such magnitude that they involve the lives of literally thousands and thousands and thousands of people.
Colin Powell and the American Defense Secretary, Dick Cheney, flew in to check the plans. Schwarzkopf said he'd attack in 2 weeks, not before.
Dick liked Norm, respected Norm, had confidence in Norm, but every now and then Dick reflected on the fact that this was a very important operation. It was for all the marbles, as we say. And Norm was known to be volatile. Norm was known to be also reluctant. I sort of get the tag for being the reluctant warrior, but you won't find many of my military colleagues who were anxious to race into this before we were ready to race into it.
Despite the bombing of Iraq, Saddam Hussein still had 400,000 troops around Kuwait, behind a barrier of minefields, trenches, and barbed wire. He believed he and his generals could force a bloody stalemate if Allied troops attacked these defenses, and that the lesson of Vietnam was America would not tolerate heavy casualties.
Saddam thought the American troops were not prepared for the experience of battle, and that Vietnam had traumatized the American administration.
Schwarzkopf was worried. He was relying on B-52s from the Vietnam era to destroy the Iraqi forces dug in around Kuwait. They dropped 72,000 bombs. Most fell on empty desert. A mistake in the programming of the B-52's navigation system was discovered. Even then, high winds still blew most bombs off course.
We thought that we would destroy tanks somewhere between the 20 and 30 a day, and we weren't coming anywhere close. We were down in the area of 6 or 8. And so after about 10 days of that, I knew that we had to do something different.
Glosson now sent 2 F-111 jets on a mission that would have far-reaching consequences.
Ready? Now, laser on.
When they reached the Iraqi front lines, the crews saw that even the best camouflaged tank showed up as a white rectangle on their heat-detecting cameras. The tanks had grown hot in the daytime sun.
20 seconds. There's definitely something there. 342 is east.
Unlike the B-52s, the F-111s carried laser-guided bombs.
4, 3, 2, 1, impact. Okay, sequence. Okay.
One by one, hundreds of tanks were picked off. Under the constant bombing, the Iraqi army began to disintegrate. The Allies didn't realize, but some 200,000 Iraqi soldiers deserted.
It had a devastating effect. Let me give you an example. We inspected one infantry division. There should have been 15,000 soldiers in that division, but we found only 34. There was no one left. 34 out of 15,000.
Colin Powell and Dick Cheney returned from their visit to Schwarzkopf. They told an impatient George Bush the Allied troops could attack in 2 weeks. Bush was anxious the date didn't slip. Moscow's support, crucial to the coalition, was weakening. Earlier that day, the Soviets had suggested postponing the attack to allow negotiations.
Any action that is taken, we are not going to suit somebody else's timetable.
whether he lives in Baghdad or any place else.
When the War Cabinet met to inspect the plan of attack, the President's impatience was tempered with a stark warning. The fighting on the ground would be bloodier than he expected.
Colin made a very eloquent statement, warning everybody it was going to be a lot uglier and a lot messier than they thought. The battle would not go as the plans said, and that he had an obligation to warn the President about casualties, that there were unpredictable circumstances in war, and that once it started, the President was no longer in control.
But the President's impatience was justified.
Was targeted by rockets, by missile or by bomb? By rockets.
On Gorbachev's orders, a high-ranking Soviet diplomat traveled to Baghdad. Yevgeny Primakov's mission was to urge Saddam Hussein to accept a face-saving deal. After inspecting the damage, Primakov was taken to a government guest house in central Baghdad.
He came in wearing a long trench coat. It was cold. There was an electric stove on. When we were left alone, I told him, "I'm not a military expert, but if a land offensive begins, your troops in Kuwait will be wiped out. You have a great burden of responsibility." Then he said for the first time quite directly, "Okay, I'm going to withdraw my troops from Kuwait. I just want to be sure that as I retreat, they don't shoot me in the back."
"48 hours before the ground attack was due, Iraq's Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz arrived in Moscow. Saddam's admission that he was willing to withdraw had led to frantic Soviet diplomacy to save their old ally from defeat. Aziz went straight to the Kremlin. The Soviet president was waiting. Aziz told Gorbachev he wouldn't accept the UN resolutions that called for Iraq to recognize Kuwait's independence and pay compensation. But he said Iraq would withdraw from Kuwait. Gorbachev thought that was good enough. He telephoned Washington.
We kept coming back to him and saying, "No, you continually are suggesting approaches which do not require an unconditional withdrawal." And we were never going to accept a negotiating down from the UN resolutions.
Nevertheless, the president summoned his key advisors to a critical meeting. On offer was what they'd always wanted, an Iraqi withdrawal without the need for a bloody land war. But Saddam would walk away unpunished and undefeated. At dawn, the president called Gorbachev to tell him the deal was unacceptable.
The president just said, "No, I'm sorry." You know, he's had all the chances. He's had months. He's had from August 2nd. We have given him every opportunity. And we've told him that this aggression would not stand. And now it's too late.
Bush could have said, "Okay, let us have a ceasefire and then discuss the other matters." He did not accept the ceasefire. He continued the war according to his own schedule. He didn't care about what Gorbachev said and reached with me. He had a schedule.
The coalition was under strain. The French President François Mitterrand called, demanding more time for diplomacy. But then Saddam Hussein intervened.
We received word that Saddam had blown the oil wells, and I went rushing up to the Oval Office, and Bush used it right then in the telephone call with Mitterrand, sort of, "Francois, we've just received this piece of information that shows that we cannot delay, that Saddam is going to produce a catastrophe in Kuwait. He's already set all the oil wells on fire, and God knows what he may do next." And that pretty well resolved that issue.
Two armies faced each other on the edge of battle.
The coalition will give Saddam Hussein until noon Saturday to do what he must do. Begin his immediate and unconditional withdrawal from Kuwait.
Hundreds of oil wells blazed across Kuwait. Saddam Hussein was destroying what he could not keep. He ignored George Bush's ultimatum. Obeying it would have humiliated him in the eyes of the Arab world.
I have therefore directed General Norman Schwarzkopf to use all forces available to eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait.
Schwarzkopf planned for the U.S. Marines to attack first, straight into Kuwait. He hoped this would convince the elite Republican Guard to move south to counterattack. Then, 400 miles to the west, French and American airborne troops would begin encircling the battlefield. Arab armies would support the attack into Kuwait. 24 hours after the initial assault, the heavy armor of the American and British armies would smash through the Iraqi front line and attack through the lightly defended western desert.
I always thought that there was a reason why they left the West open, and that this would be a place where they would lay down a biological attack, whether it be anthrax or whether it be botulism.
And I had my intelligence staff using terms like chemical killing sack, nuclear detonation area, and this sort of thing to describe possible scenarios as to why that area was left open.
I would wake up in the middle of the night in cold sweat, just thinking about, would they use them? Would they use them in the area out west where there was not a lot of troops, and we thought there must be a reason for that.
Schwarzkopf's plan meant Walt Boomer, the commander of the U.S. Marines, would be the first to lead his men into action. Despite the air war, Boomer feared storming the minefields and barbed wire of southern Kuwait would be a murderous affair, fought under a barrage of Iraqi chemicals and nerve gas.
We were outnumbered when we attack into Kuwait. Sometimes people have lost sight of that. But in addition to being outnumbered, there was this overriding concern, overwhelming concern about chemical warfare. This just occupied most of my waking moments.
Beneath smoke from the burning oil wells, the assault units pulled on the clumsy charcoal-lined suits that might save their lives in a chemical bombardment. Marine engineers began to crawl through the miles of minefields, bunker complexes, and barbed wire that protected the Iraqi front line. As they advanced, they used fiberglass rods to probe for mines so they could mark out safe paths for the first troops to race through.
You see mines everywhere. You can look left and right and you see mines, half-buried mines, full-view mines. Just as far as you can see, you look left and right, and there's desert, and there's just lines and lines and lines and groups of mines out there. We crawled, low crawled, which is on your belly, probing along with the fiberglass rods. 70 meters in front of you, Iraqis. Marine snipers are behind us trying to suppress Iraqis that are moving through the trench lines. You hear artillery, mortars, small arms.
Constantly under fire, Restifo carved paths through two minefields blocking the main attack. Meanwhile, 17,000 Marines headed for the beaches of Kuwait City. 2 weeks before, a landing had been on the cards, but the defenses were so strong the Marines would have been cut to pieces. Now, Schwarzkopf wanted to convince the Iraqis an amphibious assault was imminent. To reinforce the deception, Lieutenant Tom Dietz was ordered to plant bombs on a beach close to the city, so its defenders would think a landing zone was being cleared. The 16-inch guns of the battleship Missouri shelled the beaches to complete the deception. The Missouri had fought in World War II. Many of its shells were made in the 30s. Within months, the last battleships would be decommissioned and the shells sent to museums. But the bombardment achieved its purpose. Iraqi troops moved to the coast and away from the point where the Marines would attack.
First Marine Division will cross west of the El Wafra in zone at approximately 0:1200 at H hour.
In the desert, the Marine commanders rehearsed their plans for the last time. They expected a tough fight.
While I remain apprehensive about some of their capability, I'm also confident that we can work through that. I think we can work through their chemical capability.
The attack began.
I don't think anyone predicted that the Marines would get much farther than maybe 5 kilometers. At the very most, maybe 8. And that then, with the enormous, overwhelming forces that were arrayed in that area, that it would stop the Marines.
We're going through the breach.
But by dawn, the generals realized something remarkable had happened. The Marine columns were driving through the enemy positions, serenaded by loudspeakers playing the Marine hymn.
Iraqi fighting positions.
While Allied aircraft watched for a counterattack, thousands of Marines poured into Kuwait, almost unopposed.
We expected casualties somewhere in the 25 to 30% range. But there was essentially no firefights, essentially no battles. The Iraqis were there, but they elected not to fight. In many respects, they could retreat and they could surrender much faster than we could attack or advance. And that the war really became a war of collection of enemy prisoners of war.
6 weeks of relentless attack from Allied aircraft had convinced the Iraqi conscripts in the front line their cause was hopeless. Half had deserted by the time the attack came. Those that stayed, shell-shocked, often in tears, were waiting their chance to surrender.
Get out. Down.
In Baghdad, Saddam Hussein was told of the news.
You're all right. You're all right. All right.
Saddam said our young soldiers were behaving like women. They weren't fighting like real men. This wasn't fair to our proud army. Our army didn't believe in this war. It was a dirty war, this war in Kuwait.
The Marines in the lead tanks headed for Saddam's second line of defense, armored divisions from the regular army.
10th Marines, this is Control. Is the last of your unit on Red 1 yet?
Command posts waited for the first chemical attack.
We got 10th Marines forward through yet?
But Baghdad had taken a decision.
Roger, Division 4.
We didn't think that it was wise to use them. That's all what I can say, that it was not wise to use such kind of weapons in such kind of a war with such an enemy.
If chemicals had killed large numbers of the Marines threading their way through the minefields, the Pentagon planned to flood Baghdad with 6 feet of water.
Knocking off the dams on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers would have caused enormous destruction downstream. The loss of civilian life would have been terrible, and we really had not thoroughly analyzed. We knew how to hit the dams, but I don't know if we analyzed what the effect downstream would have been. But nevertheless, it would have been a good one to threaten the Iraqis with. And of course, there was always the implicit threat of nuclear weapons. I don't think we ever would have used them, but nevertheless, the Iraqis didn't know that. And we could have if provocation was serious enough.
Lay down your weapons, come up. We will not hurt you. We are here to help you.
In these first hours, 8,000 Iraqis were captured.
Be home soon.
After Vietnam, the American military vowed never to underestimate an enemy. But in Vietnam, the enemy had fought for a cause he was willing to die for.
My own guess is that about 75% of them gave up and about 25% fought. As the day wore on, I began to become elated.
In Schwarzkopf's war room, relief mixed with the fear of heavy counterattacks. But the attacks were not materializing. By the morning's end, Schwarzkopf came to realize the Marine success was endangering his plan to trap the Republican Guard. The U.S. Marines had advanced into Kuwait so quickly the Republican Guard hadn't come south to counterattack. Schwarzkopf's plan to lure them to destruction was failing. And the American and British tank forces were not due to attack until the following day. That would give the Republican Guard time to escape.
I decided to move the main attack up to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. One of the principles of the overall campaign was to inflict as much damage on the Republican Guard as we possibly could, and they were sitting very, very deep, you know, out back in the desert. And so, therefore, it became obvious that if we were going to inflict that damage on the Republican Guard, we had to go ahead and inflict it as early as possible.
In the 30 minutes before the troops attacked, British and American artillery fired 11,000 rounds at the Iraqi front lines ahead.
Northing 0324, 4500. Store. Altitude plus 337.
For the first time, the British used the MLRS, the multiple launch rocket system. Each rocket exploded above the enemy troops, spraying the ground with hundreds of grenades. In those 30 minutes, over 600,000 MLRS grenades fell on the Iraqi positions. The general leading the attack was a careful and methodical soldier. He'd seen war before. In Vietnam, he'd lost one of his legs.
Memories of Vietnam are very sharp, clear to me. I mean, never far from my mind, and especially during the Gulf War. We didn't say it to each other, but I think we all felt that we're going to do it right this time.
As the barrage lifted, American and British troops surged across the desert. This was the army that had been stationed in Europe to fight World War III against the Soviets. Now, the end of the Cold War allowed it to be unleashed against Iraq. The generals expected 2 days of fighting to breach the front-line defenses, followed by 6 days of fierce tank battles with the Republican Guard.
I thought that we would lose somewhere between, in the breaching units, that we would lose somewhere between 20 and 40%.
The American 1st Infantry Division had the job of storming the trenches to clear a path for the British tanks. To avoid hand-to-hand fighting, they planned to bury alive the Iraqi defenders.
A thought occurred to me, we could actually use these plows to fill in the trenches. In fact, I had tested it myself. I got down in the ditch myself and had 2 tanks plow towards me just to see what it did. I learned several things. One is I learned that it happens very quickly. So the defender has a choice to make, but he has to make it very quickly. He can either give up and hop out of the trench, he can try to run down the trench and get away, but he better do those quickly because these things move at amazing speed down there.
Along the Iraqi border ran a sand barrier, a berm. Beyond it lay 5 miles of minefields and then the Iraqi trenches. 60 miles of trenches were plowed under. Most Iraqis surrendered. The official army estimate is that 150 were buried. Before dawn, 10 Special Forces teams had flown ahead of the advance and hidden behind enemy lines. Concealed in hides, they peered through peepholes, watching for signs of an Iraqi counterattack or for the deployment of chemical or nuclear weapons. One team, Alpha 525, hid on the banks of a drainage canal.
There was 2 girls and a small boy, and they come up and actually looked into the peephole, into the face of the sergeant that was inside the peephole. 2 of my soldiers left the hide site, the back of it, into the ditch with automatic silenced weapons and a silenced pistol, and actually had these children in the sights of the pistol and inquiring of me, what are we going to do? What should we do with these children? Should we shoot them? And I know in my heart, had I told them to shoot, they would have shot them children. But it was an instantaneous decision. No, we're not going to shoot children. It's not their war.
Alpha 525 was soon attacked by 150 soldiers. They killed 40, but the attacks kept coming.
I can remember feeling inside myself that, my gosh, we're all going to die here. There's no way that we can get out of this. They would mount attacks, and they would give out a yell, an Arab battle cry, like, and it was terrifying.
American F-16s were called in. The men below flashed a mirror to show their position.
And it really wasn't until we was on the helicopter and well on our way back that finally it hit me, like we made it out of here without a single soldier hurt, which was a miracle.
In Washington, it was Sunday morning. President Bush was awaiting news. Heavy casualties risked the destruction of his presidency and the abandonment of the war.
I got briefed just before I went into the church. The president was right ahead of me. I passed him a note that said, Mr. President, things are going very well. We all went back to the White House. I got out a map from Time magazine to sort of show him exactly what was happening. And I was able to tell him there that things were going extraordinarily well. We had assumed that the toughest part of the ground war in terms of casualties would have been the early hours of that conflict. And in fact, what we were finding was that the air war had been enormously effective and decimated the Iraqi forces, and that they, in fact, were collapsing in front of us.
On the second day, the Marines pushed on towards Kuwait City. Ahead, they believed, lay Saddam's second line of defense, the well-equipped armored divisions of the regular Iraqi army. But for once, the Iraqis had surprise on their side. Out of the burning oil fields on the Marines' right flank, hundreds of Iraqi tanks began to advance. The Americans regrouped. They were facing a counterattack Saddam Hussein had personally approved.
I objected to this. I said I'm not in favor of this counterattack because the divisions that have retreated need to double their strength before they can attack and regain their battlefield positions, and we didn't have those kind of reserves. Saddam said, no, let's leave the general in charge to sort that out. 2 hours later, they told us the divisions had regained their positions. Saddam looked at me and said, didn't I tell you this way is better?
Need to ask Charlie what time he needs these A6s.
At the Marine Air Operations Center, a response was organized. Orders were passed to a flight of 4 Cobra helicopter gunships stationed at a makeshift airbase near the Kuwaiti border. As the Cobras took off, the Marines on the ground were already fighting the largest tank battle in their history.
We'd got the word that there was an Iraqi counterattack. As we arrived out there, we saw horizon to horizon Iraqi tanks, armored vehicles. And as we started hitting these tanks and things started happening in our favor, the attack basically just ground to a halt. All the tanks stopped, the armored vehicles stopped, the hatches flew open, the Iraqis started bailing out of the tanks and, scrambling around in the desert trying to figure out what was going on.
The Iraqi troops tried to retreat into the oil smoke.
It was like, something out of a, spaghetti western with the tripwire and the horses falling. It was, as you engage these troops with 20 millimeter, it was the first time I'd ever done that, and they just kind of pitch over in the desert.
Over 100 armored vehicles were destroyed. Saddam was told the advance on Kuwait City had resumed.
He was very upset. He was deeply depressed, and for reasons known only to himself, he accused 5 top-ranking officers of betrayal and then ordered their execution. The sentence was carried out immediately by his personal guards.
Once we broke that counterattack, we broke their back. That was the last gasp on their part to throw us back out of Kuwait. And from then on, we had a pretty straight shot into the city.
That night, a Scud missile landed on an American barracks, killing 28 soldiers, the worst casualties so far.
All the people are up here!
Saddam Hussein had always hoped casualties would undermine American resolve. But now it was too late. Saddam issued a general order to withdraw.
Saddam himself issued the order to withdraw. When the land assault started, he became desperate. He was now convinced that it was impossible for him to keep Kuwait.
In Kuwait City, Iraqi soldiers began to pile into every vehicle they could find. A vast convoy took shape. These pictures were taken by the Kuwaiti resistance.
I frequently talked to the resistance in Kuwait City via satellite telephone. I picked up, and it was a colonel from the Kuwaiti Air Force who'd been trapped in Kuwait City, and he'd been in the resistance all this time. He started to tell me about the Iraqis forming up and fleeing the town. He became so emotionally happy, relieved, overjoyed about his country being freed, the terrible oppressors leaving. He started to cry. I'm embarrassed to say it, but I started to cry as well. I've never been so touched in my entire life.
An F-15 crew, their aircraft laden with bombs for an attack into Iraq, was given a new mission. They were told to attack the convoy leaving Kuwait City and stop it at all costs. As the crew walked to their aircraft, their commanding officer spoke to them. He'd received an early report of the casualties caused by the Scud missile that had landed on Dhahran.
I told him of the importance of the mission. It's not just a retreating army. And these guys are rapists, killers, murderers. And coincidentally, a Scud had just hit Dhahran airport and killed 60 Americans. and convince them, and I'm sure that I did, that they needed to put some hate in their heart and go out and stop those son of a bitches from getting out of Kuwait.
As we dove out of the clouds, the picture was absolutely astounding. There were thousands of headlights heading on every road that led north out of Kuwait City.
It's almost like hitting the jackpot. I mean, there are vehicles all over the place. It is a very lucrative target.
We had 12 500-pound bombs, and we elected to drop them 3 at a time.
Krauss and Seidel's bombs destroyed the lead vehicles and created a huge traffic jam. Soon, other aircraft arrived. They had had time to load up with cluster bombs.
There were many wounded people on the road, some of them without arms or legs. They were just stranded there, half dead. When they saw our car, they started to crawl towards us. We didn't have space for them. With all the strength they could muster, they were hitting the side of the car. The windows were smeared with blood. But we had no space. We had to drive on.
The pilots called it the Highway of Death. 3 days into the land war, the army that had occupied Kuwait City no longer existed as a fighting force. Thousands of footprints led off into the desert. Hundreds had been killed. In the coming hours, what had happened here would become an important factor in ending the war.
Why did we bomb them? Because there was a great deal of military equipment on that highway. I had given orders to all of my commanders that I wanted every piece of Iraqi equipment that we possibly could destroyed. This was not a bunch of innocent people just trying to make their way back across the border to Iraq. This was a bunch of rapists, murderers, and thugs who had raped and pillaged downtown Kuwait City, and now were trying to get out of the country before they were caught.
Later that day, the British also experienced the destructiveness of air power. The British division had peeled away from the main American thrust to attack the Iraqi reserves behind the old front line. Mostly it was a matter of rounding up thousands of demoralized soldiers. Iraqi troops killed only 1 British soldier. But just before 3 o'clock, British troops captured an Iraqi position known as Objective Steel. 2 British warriors, full of infantrymen, took up position near the Iraqi trenches. What happened next remains controversial. The British say they told the Americans where they were. The Americans deny this. What is certain is that while the British prepared to destroy the Iraqi emplacements, 2 American A-10s concluded the warriors were enemy tanks.
It was just like a flash. And then suddenly you've got this searing pain across your face and your hands up.
And then all of a sudden, I had this vision of myself floating up towards the air, and I remember saying to myself, well, you know, that's your numbers up sort of thing. Now you're on your way to heaven.
I look in the back of the vehicle, and what I saw in the back of my vehicle, I would never want to see anything like that again in my life.
And I realised that 2 of the 2 lads who died in the rear of the vehicle, who was sitting next to me.
And I see the second vehicle, the vehicle that had come around to help us, is suddenly going in and out like a pressurised can. It's expanding and contracting and expanding and then contracting. And I realised in that split second that that vehicle was going to explode.
9 men died. Friendly fire killed at least 35 Americans, a quarter of their dead. An American spy plane now recorded this radar image of the battlefield. It showed the Republican Guard, Saddam Hussein's best troops, starting to escape. To Schwarzkopf's fury, American forces had yet to engage these elite divisions, over 60,000 men and their tanks.
Here we have the golden opportunity to accomplish far beyond our dreams what it is we set out to accomplish and to get this thing over once and for all very quickly. And it doesn't seem like we are able to capitalize on that opportunity.
The American tanks were driving hard. Schwarzkopf wanted them to drive harder. He had assumed the Republican Guard would move south to defend Kuwait, but they hadn't, and the Americans were struggling to make up the distance. Schwarzkopf wanted a headlong charge. The commander on the ground was more cautious.
You get a probability of increased casualties. You get the probability of an attack that starts and stops and starts and stops, loses momentum. I wanted to hit the Republican Guards with a 3-division fist. I didn't want to poke at them with fingers, in other words, piecemeal commitment of my forces. I want to hit them with a fist at full speed,
On the third afternoon of the war, battle was finally joined with the Republican Guard. An armored cavalry troop of 9 tanks and 12 infantry carriers was leading the American advance. Ahead, behind a slight rise in the desert, Republican Guard tanks waited in ambush. The first tank approached.
As we crested the rise, my gunner identified tanks to our direct front. He said, "Identified tanks." I yelled, "Fire." As I was yelling fire on the intercom, the gun erupted. The round impacted on the frontal slope of the tank, and the tank commander was ejected out of the hatch, and he himself was in flames. As the other tanks crested the rise, they began to select their targets and engage in an almost simultaneous manner. So 15 seconds before, there was a cohesive or coherent Iraqi defense. 15 seconds later, that defense was completely in flames. When we look back over the armored vehicles, you think, my God, this is what an armored cavalry troop in the assault can accomplish in that short amount of time.
They called it the Battle of 73 Easting, after the map coordinate. 28 Republican Guard tanks were destroyed. That night, the Americans routed an entire division of the Republican Guard. The other 5 Republican Guard divisions started a desperate retreat. Their best hope of survival came from an unlikely quarter.
Colin Powell and Dick Cheney came over to the White House to give the president their daily report on how the war was going. And by that time, we knew both from the military reports and from satellites about the highway of death leading north out of Kuwait City and the incredible destruction of the Iraqi convoys and so on. We knew all this would eventually be on television. And I remember very clearly Colin Powell saying that this thing was turning into a massacre, and that to continue it beyond a certain point would be un-American, and he even used the word unchivalrous.
While the American army battled the Republican Guard, the Iraqi positions around Kuwait lay empty. American Marines gathered outside the city. The question now was whether the Republican Guard could be destroyed before it became politically expedient to stop a war which had already achieved its main purpose: the liberation of Kuwait. "72 hours after launching their offensive, the U.S. Marines gathered amid the burning oil fields outside Kuwait City. They had defeated its Iraqi defenders with fewer casualties than anyone had dared hope. But to the north, the battle to destroy Iraq's Republican Guard was still raging. Destroyed Iraqi tanks lined the road into Kuwait City. The Marine commander had feared thousands of his troops would die. 28 had, but now the city was his.
We had made arrangements for the Arab coalition forces to go into the city. And I was sitting there getting a little restless and wondering, okay, what are we going to do? I'm tired of sitting here, so we drove into the city. And the outpouring was something I'll never forget. I don't know where all the people came from. They came down to the side of the road by the thousands. And they had Kuwaiti flags, and some had American flags. Vehicles that the Iraqis hadn't stolen or destroyed, they had acquired some of those, so they were driving around us in this mad circle. I thought, sure, we were going to crush a vehicle. What they were saying was, God bless you, America, God bless you. You know, we love you. Very, very emotional moment for us after all of this.
Saddam Hussein had expected a bloody stalemate on the battlefield that would undermine the coalition's resolve. Now he was fighting to survive. The Allies wanted to destroy his retreating army, above all its elite Republican Guard divisions, and break Iraq as a military power. His regime was judged unlikely to survive such humiliation.
He sat in front of me, and he was almost in tears. Not crying, but almost in tears. He said, "We do not know what God will bring upon us tomorrow." He was virtually collapsing. He had reached the depths.
Kuwait City was free, but the most intense fighting of the war was about to begin. While the British rounded up the army in the south, the American tanks were chasing Iraq's best troops, the Republican Guard. Except for a rear guard, they were retreating, but the Americans were determined to destroy them.
We never once said to anybody, your mission is going to be complete as soon as we kick the Iraqis out of Kuwait. That was not what we told our forces. We said to our forces that we wanted to close with and destroy the Republican Guards.
The Iraqi rear guard prepared for battle. As the Americans advanced, scores of tanks from the Republican Guard's Medina division were dug in along a low ridge. The defensive line stretched for 6 miles. What happened next became known as the Battle of Medina Ridge.
I know there's enemy out there, but I don't know where the heck they're at. And then, boom, we were in it. I look up, and it was about 3,700 meters away, and there's BMPs and T-72s sitting on the ridge.
And we discovered later from a sergeant we captured that we had caught them during lunch.
Whole brigade online within 3 seconds had let loose with their first rounds. Moving about 20, 25 miles an hour like a cavalry charge towards the Iraqi emplacements. And all you could see every time we shot was a massive explosion.
The Iraqi tanks only had a range of 1 mile, around half that of the American tanks.
The turrets were flipping 40, 50 feet in the air. 11 tons of steel just, it was incredible to see a gun tube and the turret just spinning up in the air and landing hundreds of yards away from the vehicles.
It was really awe-inspiring, the destructive power of that unit. And I distinctly remember you have this feeling in the pit of your stomach about the power that thing has and it can bring to bear.
We took prisoners, very few, at Medina Ridge. Very few. I saw 3. And in the desert you could see for miles. Most people I saw were dead. Later on in the battle, when I rolled up there was pieces everywhere. I have never seen such destruction in my life. I was just shocked that people can do so much devastation in such a short period of time.
In all, 300 Iraqi tanks and armored vehicles, together with their crews, were destroyed along the 6-mile front. 1 American was killed. Nothing stood between the retreating Republican Guard and destruction. A radio message told Saddam Hussein of the defeat.
Saddam thought his downfall was imminent. He asked me, "Do you think the Allies will come as far as Baghdad?" He was quite desperate and frightened.
With the rear guard destroyed, Schwarzkopf sent American tanks driving for the sea. Meanwhile, more tanks and airborne forces raced to close the trap on the Iraqi troops. 60 helicopters from the American 101st Airborne Division leapfrogged 100 miles deep into the Iraqi desert. Their mission was an ambitious one. The troops had orders to build an airbase from which Apache helicopter gunships could attack the Republican Guard until the American tanks closed in. Within 2 hours, the base was operational. Waves of Apache gunships arrived and refueled. Then they headed north to hunt the enemy. Doug Gabram led one flight of 4 Apaches.
We took off due north as fast as we could go, probably 30 feet off the ground, 120 knots. The terrain changed. We started flying over marshes.
This is what Gabram could see through his gun camera. He found the Iraqis on a causeway across the marshes north of Kuwait.
We saw people, dismounted infantry. I'd see the AK-47 raised with the white flag on it. Initially, I didn't fire. My chalk 2 or 3 would say, "Hey, the guy's shooting at us. You know, they're shooting at us with white flags on the end of their barrels." And my philosophy changed, and then I'm not going to take any chances. So when I see troops, I'm going to fire.
I got people running on the road there. I only count 3 airplanes. Where's the other?
Hundreds of soldiers were lying in the reeds along the edges of the causeway.
Second fire on your left door right now. This is over here, Cat 44. There, you got 1 second on uniform. And scratch 1, BMP. Second fire.
As Gabram continued down the causeway, an American pilot who'd been shot down and was parachuting to the ground put out an emergency broadcast. The pilot landed safely. A rescue helicopter set off. 5 of the 8 crew would not survive.
This was an opportunity to really go save somebody, we thought, and we took 2 Apaches and my Black Hawk and just started going there. Right within a couple kilometers of where this guy supposedly was, and we're still seeing American troops, so we thought, man, it's going to be not difficult. And then all of a sudden, like maybe a minute later, we are in the middle of a crossfire, which is the worst anti-aircraft guns we'd ever had. We'd gotten shot at before, but it was clear that these guys were waiting for us. You could feel the aircraft shudder, and I think that's when the tail boom kind of separated from the rest of the aircraft. And then everything went black. It was some time later, and all of a sudden I just realized I was lying down, and I thought I was dead. It was the most weird feeling, because nothing hurt, and I couldn't hear anything, and it was very peaceful, and I thought, well, I must be dead. I looked up, and I saw 5 Iraqi guys with their rifles pointed at me. So then I knew I wasn't dead, and I knew I was captured. And then one of them reached down, grabbed me by the arm, and stood me up, and that's when he separated my already broken right arm. And then I knew I was pretty badly hurt, and clearly not dead.
All afternoon, waves of gunships attacked the Iraqi troops. In the confusion of battle, no one could be sure how many units were retreating undetected. But the American forces intended to cut them off and trap them all in a ring of Allied tanks.
Big two. This is one of the dragon-looking bunch. This is, shit, I don't know what the hell to do with these guys. They are 30. Okay, they're leaving.
We spent the whole journey on foot, walking among dead bodies. Dead soldiers were everywhere. The army's morale had collapsed.
It doesn't seem like this third war. I just feel sorry for them, and when you throw out food, they all run, and it doesn't seem like they want to fight.
70,000 had surrendered. The Americans no longer bothered to guard them. They just sent them to the rear.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
To close the trap on the Iraqis, and particularly the Republican Guard, the fighting had to continue. But in Washington, America's most senior general worried that horrific television pictures of the slaughter would eventually stain the reputation of the U.S. military.
The question was, how much additional destruction do we want to inflict upon the Iraqi army that was in the Kuwait theater?
Powell decided to call Norman Schwarzkopf. It was 7 a.m. in Washington, 3 p.m. in the desert.
Colin said to me, "What are your plans?" My response to him was, "We plan to continue to execute the operation and continue to drive towards the sea, east towards the sea." And he then said to me, "How long would that take you?" And my response to him was, it will take until the end of tomorrow. So we could cease fire tomorrow evening at dark, and we would have completely accomplished the plan.
Sitting in the Pentagon, Powell knew this meant another day of killing. The president had to make a decision.
After talking to Schwarzkopf, I went over to the White House. I took the president through the situation on the ground. I pointed out that we were starting to see some scenes that were unpleasant. And we were in the window of calling an end to it so as that there was not unnecessary additional loss of life on the part of American and coalition forces or on the part of Iraqi youngsters.
Colin said, we basically have done it. We have destroyed the Republican Guard. We have expelled them from Kuwait. We have essentially completed our objectives, and I believe we are just a few hours from completing that effort.
And I would expect that within the next 24 hours, I would be bringing you a recommendation with respect to the cessation of hostilities. The president then said, well, if that's the case, we're within the window, why not end it now?
And there was a feeling, I think it was especially pronounced on the part of General Powell, that we'd asked the troops to do about all we could do by way of continuing the slaughter. I mean, in fact, the Iraqi resistance was collapsing fairly rapidly. And it was pretty clear that we'd won a tremendous victory.
Colin Powell called me. He said, "I'm at the White House. We've discussed ending the war. Could you, in fact, execute a ceasefire if it was declared effective midnight Washington time tonight?" Which would have been first thing in the morning, our time. I told him that I could live with that.
And he said, yeah, I think that's probably the right thing to do, or words to that effect.
Quite frankly, the driving force behind my saying that I could live with it was the fact that if we went on another day, we were going to kill some more of our people, and we had already won an overwhelming victory with a minimum of casualties, and that was good enough for me.
While Powell and Schwarzkopf talked, the president telephoned his allies. He informed them that the time had come to end the war.
And at 5:57, 3 minutes before 6, the president reaffirmed his decision. He says, I think this is the thing to do. And that was it. That was the decision.
It was a decision that, that as best I can recall, there was absolutely no dissent from on the part of any of the president's advisors.
Deep down, I wondered if we really had done quite enough, but I did not dissent from the decision. Did not argue that we should go another day.
It would be another 24 hours after the war had ended before surveillance photographs would show that half of the Republican Guard's tanks had survived.
Well, I was no longer there. I think perhaps I might have argued it very differently if I had been, and very firmly. And I think that I might have said, look, maybe this thing would never have got started unless I was a firm enough ally to do it. And I can only tell you that in my experience, we've got to do the job properly before we finish.
In the war room, there had been no thought of a ceasefire. After 6 months of planning, the next day would see the Iraqis trapped.
General Schwarzkopf walked into the war room, and he said, "We are going to have a ceasefire." Well, I thought that he was jesting, so I said, "That's bullshit." So he says, "No, I'm serious. We will have a ceasefire." So I said, "We have not accomplished our mission. Why is it that we're going to stop what we set out to do and stop the war?" And General Schwarzkopf says, "Cal, God damn it, the President of the United States has made a decision to stop this war."
I was just damn glad to have the victory in our hands with a minimum loss of casualties, and I was willing to settle for that because that's a hell of a lot more than anybody's had in war in as long as I can remember.
At dawn, the British Army charged out of the desert towards the road running from Kuwait City to Iraq.
As we pulled over the top of the ridge, in front of us was the highway. We'd seen dead bodies before, but it was in the next few hours that once you were actually in and among it for the first time, walking around, clearing your positions or whatever, that's when it started, you know, they actually came across of how much carnage there was there.
None of these pictures appeared until after the war, but they were the scenes the men in the White House had anticipated as they weighed the political risks of continuing the conflict. The British troops called the road by the name the pilots had given it, the Highway of Death.
There was a young Iraqi soldier who was lying in the back of the car. He had very brown eyes that were open and staring, and he had a peaceful look on his face. It wasn't until you looked a bit closer that you realized that he was missing a hand and part of his leg had been blown off.
It seems likely that 10,000 Iraqi soldiers died in the 6 weeks preceding the ground attack.
5-6.
Another 10,000 died in the 4 days of the land war.
There was a lot of civilian equipment that had been stolen from Kuwait City. For me, the thing that I found most distressing was the smell of cheap perfume, this sweet, sickly smell. I was ready for the smell of war, but I wasn't ready for the smell of kind of everyday life and normality. I felt there was an immense sense of evil there. I mean, I detested being there. And for 3 days that we actually sat on the highway, I hated it. And it enveloped me more and more and more.
Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated. Our military objectives are met. I am pleased to announce that at midnight tonight, Eastern Standard Time, exactly 100 hours since ground operations commenced and 6 weeks since the start of Operation Desert Storm, all United States and coalition forces will suspend offensive combat operations.
3 hours later, the fighting stopped. Iraqi intelligence monitored the president's announcement.
I then rang the president and told him that Bush had agreed to this ceasefire. His mood changed, just like that. He felt himself to be a great, great hero. He started to say, "We've won, we've won." His morale rose from 0 to 100.
Each day of war had left Saddam's regime more vulnerable to overthrow. Now the humiliation was over. The greatest fear, Allied tanks in Baghdad, was gone. The Allies had stopped the war. Saddam could concentrate on surviving.
They were not kind to us. They did not love us to stay in power. It was quite clear, but they wanted to avoid casualties because George Bush entered that adventure promising the American people that it will not be another Vietnam. And he kept his promise very efficiently.
On the question of going to Baghdad, if you remember the Vietnam War, we had no international legitimacy for what we did. As a result, we, first of all, lost the battle in world public opinion. Eventually, we lost the battle at home. In the Gulf War, we had great international legitimacy in the form of 8 United Nations resolutions, every one of which said, kick Iraq out of Kuwait. Did not say one word about going into Iraq, taking Baghdad, conquering the whole country, and hanging Saddam Hussein. That's point number one. Point number two, had we gone on to Baghdad, I don't believe the French would have gone, and I'm quite sure that the Arab coalition would not have gone. The coalition would have ruptured, and the only people that would have gone would have been the United Kingdom and the United States of America. And oh, by the way, I think we'd still be there. We'd be like a dinosaur in a tar pit. We could not have gotten out, and we'd still be the occupying power, and we'd be paying 100% of all the costs to administer all of Iraq.
Two days after the ceasefire, a brigade of Republican Guards returning to Iraq fired upon the 24th Infantry Division. The Americans replied with overwhelming firepower. 7 months after Iraqi forces marched into Kuwait, the last battle had been fought. The conflict cost 240 coalition lives, 24 of them British. Stopping the war allowed a third of Saddam's forces to escape. But Iraq had been broken as a military power, and the coalition occupied a great swathe of southern Iraq. The Allies judged Saddam Hussein would now be toppled in a palace coup. Instead, another more terrible and more desperate war was about to begin. In the Iraqi cities close to the Allied front lines, Saddam's rule had collapsed. Ordinary people took up arms against the regime they hated. These pictures were filmed in Karbala, but the scene was repeated throughout southern Iraq. The rebels were predominantly Shia Muslims. They formed the bulk of the population in that part of Iraq. Again and again, President Bush had called for uprisings. Now, hours after the war's end, he did so again.
I've always said that the Iraqi people should put him aside. I want to see an end. You mentioned World War II. there was a definitive end to that conflict. And now we have Saddam Hussein still there.
In Iraq's second city, soldiers who had fled from Kuwait joined the rebels. In the prison was a Briton who had been taken there 2 months before from his home in Kuwait City.
Well, we heard small arms fire. Then there was mortar fire accompanying, then more small arms fire. The guards by this time had melted away, had disappeared. Whether they went to defend the outside perimeter or not, difficult to say. We couldn't tell. But when the gates were shot open, everyone rushed out.
It wasn't organized opposition. People just rebelled against oppression, cruelty and starvation, against the executions and detentions. There was very cruel injustice, and people rose up to overthrow this regime.
The revolutionaries had taken command by this time. There wasn't any doubt that the police and the army were not in control. And the general mood was, pleasure, joy. Everyone was free.
Basra was close enough to the American lines for Brock Matthews to hitch a ride to safety.
We did not think, the president nor any of us thought at that time that Saddam would continue in power, having suffered such a resounding defeat.
With victory achieved, the political concentration that had brought such success now seemed to desert the White House team. Norman Schwarzkopf was left to cement the details of the ceasefire with the Iraqis.
Norm Schwarzkopf said, "How did we make this happen? What do we do?" And we had a State Department representative in our war room, and we said to the State Department representative, "What is it we're supposed to do, Mr. State Department rep?" And the State Department rep gave what we call the Iraqi salute. He didn't know.
I had no instructions whatsoever, so lacking any, and based upon the conversations Cole and I had I called my stenographer in and dictated my own terms of reference, and then I called up Cohen and said, "I'm going to send these to you. If you all approve, then send them back to me, and this is what I'll do."
The Pentagon changed happy to glad, we to they, and put in a few fixes, gave it to the State Department, and the State Department changed a couple of words and sent it back to us and says, "Use this."
Schwarzkopf decided that the talks be held in coalition-occupied Iraq, near the town of Safwa. The Iraqi leadership wanted a deal that would return their captured territory and, above all, allow them to crush the rebellions without fear of Allied troops intervening. Schwarzkopf's objectives were simpler.
I went to Safwan with my own instructions, which basically, number one, was to get our POWs back, and then number two, to make sure that we had very, very clear lines drawn so that we didn't have any inadvertent battles after that.
A pair of Apache gunships hovered over the Iraqi convoy. Just hours before, Saddam had personally briefed the Iraqi generals arriving to meet Schwarzkopf.
Saddam wanted to consolidate the ceasefire in any way he could, and he ordered his officers to give any information they had about the minefields and the prisoners of war. He didn't want to give the West any excuse to resume fighting. He wanted to sign a ceasefire agreement at any price.
Accompanied by the Saudi commander-in-chief, Schwarzkopf led the defeated Iraqi generals to the tent where the meeting would be held. Once the talks got underway, Schwarzkopf got everything he wanted. But so did the Iraqis.
What they were most concerned about was that this was going to be a permanent border. And over and over again, they kept saying, is this a permanent border or is this just temporary? And I kept having to reassure them that, no, this is not a permanent border. This is a temporary demarcation line between our forces. And then this fellow looked at me and said, well, can we fly our helicopters? And I knew the great devastation we had inflicted upon their roads and their bridges, and that seemed like a very reasonable request to me.
General Sultan Hashim Agha Mishmad was a top official in the Defense Ministry. His colleague, General Salah Aboud Mahmoud, had commanded the Iraqi forces in Kuwait. The two generals had achieved the objectives Saddam Hussein had set for them. Above all, the Iraqi armed forces could operate freely within their territory. And though Iraq's fighter planes were forbidden to fly, its helicopters weren't. Saddam had the tools he needed for survival.
They should have surrendered their equipment, the lot. When you're dealing with a dictator, he has got not only to be defeated, well and truly, but he's got to be seen to be defeated by his own people, so that they identify the privations they've had to go through with his actions. And we didn't do that.
I think what we should have insisted upon is Saddam Hussein come to Safwan. That was our mistake, because that allowed him to blame his generals for the defeat, and not he himself.
Saddam Hussein now moved forces loyal to him from Baghdad to suppress the uprising. American troops could see the fighting from their positions, but they were ordered not to intervene.
My advice to the president throughout the period of this uprising is that this did not seem to me to be an operation that we needed to get involved in, because I couldn't figure out who was doing what to whom. And it would have required us to move further into Iraq and take responsibility for that part of Iraq, and for a purpose that was not stated.
And that was the quagmire. Therein laid Vietnam as far as we were concerned, because we would still be there. And what's more, given the American way of doing things, we would have then had the responsibility for rebuilding all of the infrastructure. And we were just determined not to get sucked into that trap.
Inside Iraq, as each rebel village and town fell, there were terrible reprisals. Some estimates put the dead in the tens of thousands. The Iraqi regime likes to film itself at work. These pictures show Shia prisoners and senior officers from the regime. The tape reached the West 2 years later.
The Americans did not interfere. Therefore, it took us only a few days to recover from the surprise, to reorganize our troops, reorganize our resources, and impose peace and order in the southern governors. It took us 2 weeks to do that.
Just a few miles away, 500,000 coalition troops began to leave Iraq. After months in the desert, they were returning home. The Allies still hoped one of Saddam's generals would overthrow him, but the ill-fated uprising had caused the military to rally round Saddam out of fear of something worse. The White House had miscalculated. Meanwhile, the Iraqi leader had a bargain to keep.
We didn't hear any bombing at night. And that was very strange. And you start to hope. You start to think, gosh, the war's over. You can't help it. Somebody came in and just said, get your things together, you're going. And you look around and say, what things? I have no things. And he said, go out. And you wonder if it's a trick, and you kind of put your head round the side of the cell in case somebody's waiting outside there with a cricket bat or something. And there was a line of people standing outside in yellow uniforms. And I joined the end of the line. There were hundreds of reporters, hundreds and hundreds.
And that's really quite overwhelming. I mean, you've just been in solitary. And I think that's really when you thought, well, I probably am released. Whenever anybody gets back from war, trying to convince anybody what the realities of war are like is very difficult. Not just my situation. If you've been shot at or in combat and seen friends die, you see it in the films, but you don't smell it, you don't hear it, and you don't see grown men cry, and you don't see what it's like to see real people hurt. And you can never put it in words when you return either.
Now there was a second uprising, in the north where the Kurds lived. Saddam had used chemical weapons to suppress previous revolts there, but the Kurds sensed weakness. The secret police headquarters in Sulaymaniyah was one of the regime's nerve centers. For years, Kurdish guerrillas had fought for independence. Now they united with mutinous troops and attacked. The men inside resisted desperately. They knew there was much to avenge. As night fell, the gates were stormed. A Kurdish teenager educated in Britain was there. He and his friends had listened to President Bush on the radio.
When George Bush said that he would back up a people's revolution in Iraq, then they thought, that's all we need. That's all we wanted to hear, so they just did it.
In the morning, the local people flocked to the burning building. Many were hoping to learn what had happened to family and friends who'd been imprisoned there. Some of Mustafa Aziz's school friends were among the missing.
We were really scared because of this, death camp which had been known that anyone who'd enter would never walk out again. We walked in towards this one room and we saw these hooks like you get in a butcher's shop where they hang the meat on. And on one of the hooks we saw a body. And, we saw that the Iraqis would hook people on there. I thought, how could they do this to people? There was bodies everywhere. Iraqi security officers all dead on the floor. It was raining as well at the time, and all the puddles would be just blood. I remember just swearing at the Iraqis, and I remember going up to a couple of bodies and kicking them and spitting on them.
Kurdish opposition leaders who'd been living abroad began to return. Sulaymaniyah was the heartland of the party run by Jalal Talabani. The Kurdish politicians wanted to trigger a coup against Saddam. They hoped a new Iraqi leader would let the Kurds run their own affairs. Traveling with Talabani was an American, an observer from the United States Senate. He believes that day was a turning point.
At that point, everything hung in the balance. Had the United States signaled its support for the uprising, I am convinced it would have succeeded. There were Iraqi generals who were, in fact, in touch with the opposition and who were sitting on the fence waiting to see what would happen. And when the United States did nothing, said nothing, sat on its hands, of course, they took the course of caution.
That very night, Saddam Hussein's troops attacked. Washington had decided it did not want to support an uprising that might lead to the breakup of Iraq. The rebel forces fought back, but they were hopelessly outgunned. The Kurdish leaders who'd encouraged the revolt had made a terrible miscalculation. As shells began landing on the cities, there was panic. Not only were the casualties heavy, but they feared a chemical attack at any moment. Refugees brought terrifying stories about the behavior of the advancing troops.
Anyone over 15, anyone that was capable of carrying on, they shoot. They have got no mercy whatsoever. They came with the intention of revenge.
I do not want to push American forces beyond our mandate. We've done the heavy lifting. Our kids perform with superior courage, and they don't need to be thrust into a war that's been going on for years.
The Iraqi forces advanced relentlessly, and the cities of Kurdistan emptied before them. 1 million people were on the move. They headed for the mountains, trying to reach the safety of the Turkish and Iranian borders.
When George Bush said that he didn't want the American military interfering in this, the Kurds got scared. We heard the shelling and the bombing, and our next door neighbor came round and he said, look, you've heard what people are saying about the Iraqis. I think it'd be, wise of us just to leave Sulaymaniyah. So my dad agreed and said, okay, we'll leave.
It reminded me of refugees leaving Paris in June 1940, just ahead of the German army. Everybody knew of George Bush's call for them to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein, and they all had exactly one question: why isn't Bush helping us?
The American air crews patrolling the skies above Iraq could see the Kurds being chased into the mountains, but they had strict orders not to intervene. Instead, they watched.
We saw helicopters chasing a lot of people down a road, and we saw the gunships shooting at them. You could see the smoke coming out of the gunship and occasionally see flashes of the tracers, even though the sun had just started coming up.
Everybody started to panic. I was just shocked, staring at the helicopter, and there's this bright light, a little smoke coming out, and then this red thing would just fly towards the mountain, hit the cars. Their intention was to kill us.
We felt frustrated in the fact that we couldn't help the uprising that was going on the ground for whatever political reasons that were above our rank. And best we could do is report what we saw and eventually hope that it was taken care of.
Saddam Hussein bombing, bomba, helicopters destroyed us. I don't know. They saw this, but they don't know why. We are human like you.
The only issue that came up is, should we do something about the Iraqi helicopters? It had never been one of our objectives to get involved in this kind of civil uprising between factions within Iraq and the Iraqi government. And so it was not clear what purpose would have been achieved by getting ourselves mixed up in the middle of that.
The Iraqi forces closed inexorably. But the president had promised America the troops were coming home. The British wanted to set up safe havens for the Kurds. but the president refused.
What was self-evident was that unless some action was taken, we may well be seeing the genocide of a nation. We found it intolerable, and for that reason we began to proceed with our plans to do something about it.
America and the president were celebrating. But the television images of the Kurdish exodus were making the victory ring hollow.
'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA.
Just before the celebration, the president asked James Baker to see how the situation could be diffused.
We did not want to take on the responsibility for having to create a safe haven there. And if it was going to be enforced, it wasn't going to be enforced by others. It was going to have to be enforced by Uncle Whiskers, and we really didn't want to do it.
Baker's public relations team suggested a visit to the Kurds.
As we were flying along, we all of a sudden saw a whole sea of people camped out in the mountains, and this was early spring when it was quite cold. We landed there, and then we took four-wheel drive vehicles up the mountain. There were 50 to 75,000 people in this little valley. Every piece of ground had a little tent or a makeshift shelter on it, and they'd cut down all the trees for firewood. And they were drinking out of the mountain streams, and some were barefooted.
Baker was able to spend only 7 minutes on the ground before security men hustled him away. But in those minutes, he saw and heard enough to be sure this was not just a humanitarian nightmare. It also had the potential to become a political disaster.
I called the president from the airplane and told him I'd never seen anything like this, and that a lot of people were going to die if we didn't do something and do something quickly, and that he needed to really break whatever China was required in order to get it done.
I have directed the U.S. military to begin immediately to establish several encampments in northern Iraq where relief supplies for these refugees will be made available in large quantities. I can well appreciate that many Kurds have good reason to fear for their safety. Let me reassure them that adequate security will be provided at these temporary sites by U.S., British, and French air and ground forces.
The impact on the American psyche of what happened in Vietnam, of being bogged down in a ground war that damaged America very badly, was a very real issue. And the prospect of another huge problem with large numbers of American troops going back into northern Iraq, it's hardly surprising that they weren't immediately attracted to that. But once the full dimension of what was happening, once Jim Baker saw it, once they had absorbed what we were saying to them about the seriousness of the problem, then they became engaged, and then things began to move very speedily.
The final scenes of the Gulf War were played out. The men who planned the war feared what they called the ragged end, a quagmire like Vietnam, or a stalemate like Korea. This was a ragged end no one had foreseen. Two rebellions brutally suppressed by a military which threw in its lot with Saddam and kept him in power. The Iraqi regime bided its time.
We decided that enough is enough. Let's withdraw our forces, our security from there. Let them do whatever they like for a while. Might take months or years, but in the end, they will come back to their homeland because they will realize that there is no other option for them except to be part of Iraq and part of the state of Iraq.
Two weeks after the liberation, the Emir of Kuwait returned to his country. The war might have been fought against tyranny, but it had not been fought for democracy. America honored its returning soldiers. After Vietnam, there had been no cheering crowds. But the Gulf War allowed the American military to rediscover their sense of pride and purpose. General Freddie Franks, who led the attack on the Republican Guard, had lost a leg in Vietnam. For him, this day ended a 20-year journey.
Soldiers I was with in the hospital got so tired of having to explain that they were wounded in Vietnam and people saying to them, oh, well, what a shame, all that for nothing, that they stopped talking about it. After it was all over, my wife and I walked over to the Vietnam Memorial and talked to some of the Vietnam veterans who were there. And I said to them, hey, this one's for you too.
The Gulf War did not erase the shadow of Vietnam. As Bosnia was to show, America would remain reluctant to become the world's policeman. But the American people were once again proud of their soldiers. For a time, America proclaimed a new world order. It was to prove too grand an illusion. But nonetheless, the generals had confounded those who forecast disaster.
We had accomplished an overwhelming military victory. We had accomplished all of our objectives. We had inflicted great casualties and great damage to the Republican Guard. We had inflicted great damage to the Iraqi military force, and we had ejected the Iraqis out of Kuwait, and that, after all, was the purpose of it, and we had done it all with an amazingly low loss of life.
Mr. the President of the United States!
Bush returned to the Congress in triumph. Yet 2 years later, the American people would vote him out. For the president, too, there was to be a ragged end.
I can report to the nation, aggression is defeated, the war is over.
To gain support for the liberation of Kuwait, Bush had compared Saddam Hussein to Hitler. But Saddam and his tyranny had survived. He's got his job, one campaign sticker would say. How about you?
When you demonize an enemy, such as the president attempted to do with Saddam Hussein, which was a useful way to raise public interest and support of what we were doing, we also faced the problem of if he was still there at the end of it, which he most likely would be, it would take some shine off the achievement.
That is the aggressor, Saddam Hussein, still in power. There is the President of the United States, no longer in power. There is the Prime Minister of Britain, who did quite a lot to get things there, no longer in power. I wonder who won.
Saddam Hussein might claim that by surviving, he did. But his invasion of Kuwait ended in ignominy, and his dreams of challenging Israel and dominating the Middle East turned to dust. UN teams are still destroying his nuclear and biological weapons programs. Sanctions cripple the economy. All that remains is defiance.
As long as we are alert and observant, Saddam Hussein is not a threat to his neighbors. He's a nuisance, he's an annoyance, but he's not a threat. That we achieved. It was never our objective to get Saddam Hussein. Indeed, had we tried, we still might be occupying Baghdad. That would have turned a great success into a very messy, probable defeat.
It took 7 months to extinguish the oil wells that burned across the deserted battlefield. Above all else, the Western Allies sent 500,000 men to war because of oil. As always in history, the great powers fought to protect their interests. In so doing, the West forged new alliances with the Arab world, paving the way for a permanent peace with Israel. And wars must also be measured by what they prevent. A dictator had invaded one country and was threatening to convulse the whole of the Middle East. If today Saddam Hussein is no Hitler, perhaps it is because the Gulf War ensured he did not become one.